Takahashi Shoichiro rushed onto the road, pushing his younger colleague out from under the wheels of the truck at the last moment. A terrible blow ended the life of a man who had never shown a tendency towards self-sacrifice. Panic screams and pleas to hold on dissolved into the night sky. He regained consciousness in the spiritual dimension, where an invisible voice read his dossier from the Enmapedia. His life was utterly mediocre, but the ending turned out to be heroic. The space illuminated, and the essence offered him a new life with special talents in exchange for helping her world. She called herself Lucia, the ruler of this dimension, once revered as the goddess of creation. Takahashi responded directly. He does not guarantee that he will meet all expectations, but he is willing to try. The goddess of warmth smiled gently. Everything around was engulfed in darkness, and the boy finally realized that he was indeed dead. Deafening silence. Only emptiness. From the darkness, the contours of the sleeping young man's face emerged. His body swiftly flew into the weightless abyss. Big brother, a bright girl's voice instantly pulled him out of the darkness. Someone's pale hands desperately reached through the void. The silhouette melted, scattering into crystals of light. Gift for the younger sister. He never got to return it. Bitter sorrow suddenly broke through the ringing voice of the sister calling for her brother. The darkness shuddered. The last sparks were fading. Consciousness surged rapidly from oblivion. Just a moment. The heavy sleep receded. The blinding sun struck his eyes above him, hovered Ellie, loudly demanding that he wake up. He lazily sat on the grass, mumbling a morning greeting in confusion. Together they set off to the estate. It had already been 10 years since he was reborn in this world. Returning home with his sister, he reminded himself of his new status, the eldest son of Baron Proudlord, the ruler of the Elise region. Their lands were not rich, so the boy did not linger long and headed towards the exit again. Now he was called Rainford Proudlord. Saying goodbye to his family, he set off into the forest, fully realizing that he had been reborn in a medieval fantasy world. The trees quickly hid him from foreign eyes. The Baron's estate was surrounded by emptiness, and the western part was completely covered by the Silver Forest, a dangerous territory of monsters. Rainford accelerated, and with a powerful leap, soared high up the trunk. He maneuvered easily and nimbly between the branches. Landing softly, the boy noted the rapid growth of his physical strength, a hint of talent bestowed by the goddess. Focusing, he envisioned the natural water cycle and gathered a sphere of water in his palm. With a wave of the hands, a magical rain poured abundantly over the grass. To limit the flow, Rainsford decided to create a barrier of heat-resistant bricks, combining the elements of earth and fire on the go. But he miscalculated a bit. The jets of water hit him directly, causing the guy to curse irritably. Water splashed everywhere, spreading across the entire field, and the boy cursed irritably. The boy froze, his eyes wide open in shock. With a roar, the massive stone wall in front of him shattered into pieces. He sighed heavily. Controlling such power was quite a challenge. His mana suddenly ran out, and he helplessly fell to his knees. I had to painfully squint from the sharp dizziness. Looking at his own palm, the boy remembered his childhood. Back then, after such incantations, he would immediately faint. Suddenly, something cracked behind him, making him turn around sharply. He carefully sat down on the ground among the bushes, trying to catch his breath. Suddenly, the forest shook from a wild, terrifying roar. He calmly stretched his fingers, pleased that his magical reserve had noticeably increased. The hand confidently clenched into a fist. Strength had fully returned. Sneaking up to the sound, he peeked out from behind the thick trunk. On the ground lay a strange beast resembling a wolf, and it growled warningly. Forgetting about fear, the boy emerged from cover and anxiously asked if it was intact. The small, fluffy creature whined pitifully, snuggling against the young man's hands. A terrible roar shattered the silence. The boy barely managed to press against the tree, hiding the little one. A mountain of muscles loomed behind, a gigantic horned monster. The monster with a swing smashed the ground with its fists, but the young man miraculously managed to jump back. He caught his breath in ambush behind the nearby trunk, while the rescued fluffball barked carefreely. A cold sweat broke out on his back. The young man remembered the old bestiaries and immediately recognized the snarling orc. He should have fought. He pointed 2 fingers at the monster, as if they were the barrel of a gun. A metal sphere clearly emerged in the imagination. The young man decided to create an analog of firearms, using wind magic for a powerful shot. The role of the ball itself was to be played by compacted pieces of rock, to pierce the thick skin skin of the monster accurately. He heated them to the maximum. In his mind, he constructed a spell. The earth fragments needed to be compressed like a bullet. The next step was to harden the compressed rock, and then heat it with earth magic, bringing the stone to the required density. The magic tore through the darkness. The formation of ultra-high density stone began. In the cloud of debris and sparks, a massive black monolith hovered. The boy knelt in the middle of the forest, concentrating pulsing energy in his palms. The hand gripped the weapon more firmly, and the enemy suddenly lunged forward. A huge muscular body lunged forward with all its mass, rapidly closing the distance. The boy did not back down and shouted desperately. With a short fire, he unleashed a devastating volley through the magical rings straight at the attacker. Exhausted, the young man heavily sank down under the tree, barely catching his breath from the horror he had experienced, while the back of the monster loomed before him. The fallen giant began to topple forward. With a deafening thud, the heavy carcass slammed face first into the ground just a meter away from the boy. Regaining his composure, he gently stroked the little rescued fluffball, quietly apologizing for the pain. Suddenly, his eyes widened. He remembered something important and turned sharply. Pressing the beast to his chest, the boy cautiously peeked out from behind the tree. A foreign hand reached out to the creature. Another young man with a calm, cold gaze softly said that he would take everything upon himself. The young man exhaled deeply, deciding to take everything upon himself. He knelt before the beaten child and used healing magic. The glow enveloped the little animal. The young man was not going to give up until he healed it. The puppy blinked in surprise and joyfully jumped to its feet. It barked cheerfully and started to run in circles, genuinely amusing its rescuer. But it was time to say goodbye. The sky was rapidly darkening, and an angry mother was waiting at home. The young man smiled with relief at the little animal and waved his hand, ordering it not to get into trouble again, and I went away. He easily jumped over the forest stones, calmly heading home. Suddenly, a quiet whimpering was heard behind him. The young man turned around in confusion. The rescued fluffy miracle stubbornly waddled behind. The little animal whined pitifully and rubbed against the leg, ignoring the pleas to return to its family. The defense fell. The young man surrendered, covering his face with his hand from excessive cuteness, and rushed to pet the puppy. The small creature did not back down an inch, so the young man merely sighed, yielding to its persistence. The boy gave in. There was no choice anyway. He reminded the little one of the strict parental rules, although he himself was mentally melting from that fluffy face. Lifting the little animal high above his head, he proposed to live together and immediately heard joyful barking. Complete fluffiness. The decision has been made. It was only left to give the new family member a name. Without thinking for long, the boy joyfully named him Shiro. 3 months have passed. The boy set off down the road and calmly called the little one to follow him. But when he turned around, he was stunned. Instead of a tiny puppy, there stood a giant fluffy creature that some girl was already hugging. During this time, Shiro openly flaunted. 2 boys were making their way through the night forest with a torch until they reached the point on Mr. Rain's map. One of them was stunned into silence. A huge magical crystal was shining right on the ground. Later, the find was delivered to the ancestral estate. Mom and little Ellie were excitedly examining the fiery stone, not believing that Rain had obtained it in battle with a mighty orc. The young man nodded modestly, and the girl rushed at him and threw herself around his neck. She was completely thrilled by her brother's feat. Rian gently stroked her head, melting from that joyful smile. He considered his younger sister the sweetest creature in the world. The family idyll continued. Suddenly, Mom also rushed to hug, tightly holding both children close to her, while Rain awkwardly mumbled. The commotion was interrupted by a man who approached from behind and quietly called Ellie. Miriam Proudlord was once a famous, powerful sorceress, but now she has become a gentle, somewhat absent-minded mother who supports her family. And that man turned out to be Fried, a brilliant butler who perfectly managed the household of the estate, and now quietly shed tears of pride for his matured master. Rian stood tense as the master of the house thoughtfully examined the giant magical stone on the table. As it turned out, he was worrying in vain about his family's reaction. Everyone accepted his fluffy creature with joy and without any unnecessary questions. Even though Shiro had grown to the size of a real giant that Ryan could barely wrap his arms around. But now the atmosphere in the room changed sharply. The father hugged Ellie and grew gloomy. It's time to discuss the very orc they encountered in the forest. The investigators investigative team has already scoured the area, but no traces of other similar monsters were found. The only thing left at the battlefield is the corpse of the monster and this massive trophy. Rian awkwardly recalled the sudden lake and the strange fortress wall in the thicket, but for the man, the key evidence was the crystal itself. The boy still felt no threat until he heard the terrible truth. Judging by the size of the stone, Rain had defeated not just an ordinary soldier, but the king of the orcs. This high-ranking monster has erased entire regions from the face of the earth in the past, so such a feat will be officially reported to the ruler. Everyone was stunned, staring at the shining trophy, as the hidden magical power within it was simply colossal. Rian thought, such power should be divided into smaller parts and distributed across the lands, and for that, he would have to consult the blacksmith. The boy raised his palm. Rian sat thoughtfully at the table in front of a massive magical crystal. The sudden voice of the child made him flinch. He asked to give him the stone without any unnecessary introductions. In just a minute, Rain was obediently dragging the heavy boulder behind the boy. The boy mounted the giant wolf, and they set off on their journey. Ahead lay a dead, cracked emptiness. Rian asked with doubt whether he was seriously planning to spend the crystal on this hole. The man explained that all attempts to develop the area failed due to solid rock instead of soil and a complete lack of water. But the guy calmly stated that he would bring water here and build an irrigation system. He smiled slyly. The next statement from the small one made Rain blink in confusion. He intended to build a dam. The giant water dam was meant to change this landscape forever. The scale of the idea was simply astonishing. Father blinked in surprise. What dam? Rian just smiled broadly and stated that they would have to leave everything behind. The boy calmly explained the mechanics. A dam is a giant reservoir that allows for the accumulation and sudden release of water. He pointed to the magical stone in his father's hands and asked him to lend it. Having intercepted the crystal, the boy ran forward and shouted to his father to stay away. Rain focused on the artifact in his hands. The surface of the stone cracked sharply, and water suddenly splashed out from the fissures. The father was stunned. The water whirl wrapped the crystal, and it began to change color from red to blue before his eyes. Rian carefully placed the stone on the ground. Looking back, he warned his father to prepare for strong jolts. The boy calmly stated the impossible. He had just completely changed the magical attribute of the stone from fire to water. The father looked at his son with horror. What else was he planning? And before Reina's eyes, a frame from a past life surfaced, an office subordinate whom he once covered for. The picture became increasingly clearer, the last moment of his first life, when he shielded his subordinate with his own body. Dim images from the past flashed before my eyes, my parents and younger sister. Standing at the edge of the abyss, the boy recalled that one moment when he encountered death. He raised his hands to the sky. The energy flowed through the fingers. The boy sharply directed the magical whirlwind into the ground with a single thought: if he had already been reborn. Then farewell, hellish corporations. He laughed heartily, welcoming a new life where he planned only to eat and sleep. A terrible explosion shattered the rock into pieces. He was determined to live carefree. When the dust settled, a gigantic, perfectly round crater formed in place of the rocks. Silence has once again prevailed. The young man stretched out his palms, channeling power through the stone. A turbulent waterfall crashed from the crater wall, while the boy merely stood with his hands on his hips, self-satisfied, under the astonished gaze of his companion. The rocky soil around the stream has compacted securely. The tall man next to him examined the perfect foundation and estimated that with such water pressure, this huge reservoir would fill up in just 2 days. He explained that the channels would be laid out in an even grid and connected to rivers throughout the territory. According to his calculations, the water will fill them in about 2 days. It is enough to open the sluice, and the farmland will receive a stable water supply. The father and son silently watched the turbulent stream. Suddenly, the man sharply grabbed the boy by the shoulders, asking in disbelief if he had just cast 2 spells at the same time. The boy joyfully boasted about the dam that would bring prosperity to their lands, completely unaware of his father's stupor. With a blank face, he asked where the verbal spell was. A bewildered pause hung in the air. The boy blinked sincerely, not understanding which words were being referred to. The father scanned the giant earthen walls, muttering in astonishment about the scale of this power. The man's eyes widened with cold realization, and at the same time, he innocently asked what it actually means to change the attribute attribute of a magical stone. At that moment, the boy knew absolutely nothing. Neither the change of the stone's properties, nor even more so, double enchantment was within the power of any mage in the whole world. The radiant goddess Lucia gently promised to grant him a moderate magical talent. The ability to cast multiple spells simultaneously only existed in ancient myths. So now, hanging high above the island city, he mentally shouted, "What did she mean by moderate?" The sky floated before my eyes. The goddess's statement frankly resembled mockery. "Silence," he exclaimed Lucy's name indignantly, utterly shocked by his absurd strength. In the distance, an endless, dense forest spread out. Little Rain was sitting in his father's study, reading a book about the 6 magical elements of the world: fire, earth, water, wind, light, and darkness. He was particularly drawn to light and darkness. Sparks flickered in the imagination. They swirled like tiny stars in the void. The light from them spread further and further, pulling away from the book. The boy remembered the main rule: most people have a talent for only one element. Those who conquered 3 or 4 were considered undeniable geniuses, and possessing at least 2 already guaranteed the status of a talented mage. Rain looked into the shining distance ahead of him and quietly asked himself, is it possible to have a talent for everything at once? Years later, in the library, the blonde girl joyfully clapped her hands, praising his magic, while the tall official behind them frantically considered how to report this to the king. The man slammed against the wardrobe, dripping with cold sweat. The blonde boy leaned over to Ryan and smiled contentedly, calling his abilities amazing. While the attendees enthusiastically discussed this unprecedented talent, Rain himself stood stunned, and the official by the wall could barely stay on his feet. In the end, the man simply closed his eyes and exhaled. There was no point in worrying about the consequences anymore. The man leaned on the table, realizing that he could no longer hide this from the king. He raised his hand and announced to those present, "The Rhine issue is temporarily put on hold." The boy tensed. If he remained silent about the change in the properties of the magical stones, the lord would immediately be accused of treason. Non-verbal magic and the combination of several elements are no joke. The lord thoughtfully rubbed his chin, deciding to simply observe. Reina's talent knew no bounds. The young man only awkwardly sweated from such loud words about his modest gift. Having set aside magic, the lord turned to business. Tomorrow he is heading to the capital with a report on the new dam. A full-flowing river and changes in the landscape will inevitably lead to a review of taxes. The man sternly added that this trip could no longer be postponed. The rain suddenly shone. Next year the harvest will increase significantly. He could hardly contain his joy, already imagining his ideal relaxed life on the rich lands. A sharp rustle of the dress. Someone leaned over the table and ruthlessly shattered his fantasies, bringing the guy back to the conversation. The long-haired warrior gently placed his hands on Rain's shoulders and asked him for a favor. Soon the young lord was riding through the streets on his giant fluffy wolf Shiro. Passers-by gladly bowed to the boy and his satisfied beast. In Reina's mind, the instructions were replaying. On the outskirts lives the dwarf blacksmith they needed. The boy stopped in front of the massive workshop doors. As soon as the dam is completed, their lands will finally receive water. He awkwardly leaned against Shiro. Without tools for plowing, this water would make no sense at all. In memory, a magnificent knight's sword emerged, which the same blacksmith Watts once forged on order. The warrior's face remained focused during that conversation. Rian could not hide his admiration for the master's perfect work. With a sharp clang, the man drew his blade. He was the one who sent the boy to negotiate with the reclusive gnome about creating farming equipment. Stories about the master's difficult character suddenly awakened in Rain, the memory of a past life. He remembered a similarly brilliant but eccentric head chef. The memory quickly faded away. Only the fact remained. The blacksmith had golden hands, but now an approach would have to be found for his gnome-like eccentricities. Rainford frowned, convincing himself that he must endure this for the sake of his longed-for peaceful life. He flinched. The master had just closed the door right in front of his nose, and it reeked unbearably of stale alcohol. Gathering the remnants of courage, the young man again decisively struck his fist against the wood. He loudly called himself a messenger from Clayford and addressed the blacksmith Watts. In response, the door creaked open slightly under the owner's dissatisfied muttering. The curtains creaked loudly. A gloomy, bearded man appeared at the threshold, and the boy hurried to apologize for the intrusion. Noticing the guest's noble attire, there. The blacksmith muttered to quickly come inside. Rainford was caught with a comically strained smile, trying to hide his nervousness. The blacksmith immediately warned not to trip, as the entire floor was cluttered with trash and empty bottles. Slightly trembling, the young man extended the letter with all the details with both hands. Watts sternly loomed over him and ordered him to get straight to the point. However, the herd order made the old master furrow his brows in confusion. He took the paper while Rainsford timidly explained that they needed ordinary iron tools for farming. The dwarf blacksmith cut. It is impossible to forge such details from ordinary iron. The boy immediately caught the hint and cleverly struck at his pride, as if to say, it's a pity that the creator of his father's remarkable sword can't handle such work. The master slammed his fist on the table angrily. He frowned and turned away. The boy calmly sat down and began to wait. In front of them lay a bar of incredibly rare wrought iron. The gnome continued to grumble that he wouldn't engage in such nonsense, but his fist was trembling. His fingers itched to grasp the metal that any blacksmith dreams of. Noticing his hesitation, the young man gently asked to see the workshop. The blacksmith gave in and allowed them to come in for just a minute. The boy stepped over the threshold of the spacious forge. He slowly scanned the room with his gaze. The tools were lying in their places in perfect order. Silence reigned in the workshop. The boy stepped over the threshold of the workshop. Unlike the chaos outside, there was perfect cleanliness here. He immediately understood. The master was simply burning with the desire to work. Barely noticeable marks on the equipment. Heavy hammers, mountains of prepared coal, and perfectly arranged tongs silently awaited their time. The boy took a confident step inside. A gloomy blacksmith loomed behind. He muttered that the local iron was worthless, but it would do for simple tools. The edge of a perfectly clean table. An empty stool by the forge. Zdorovany wearily waved his hand, complained about the lack of motivation, and ordered the little one to go home. Instead of answering, the boy silently clenched a chunk of raw iron in his hands. Suddenly, powerful whirlwinds of magical energy struck around him, causing the blacksmith to retreat in confusion. The boy squinted, recalling everything he had ever read about metal purification. In his mind, the luxurious father's sword clearly emerged. He intended to forge its copy right from this raw piece. The sparkling glow filled the room. "What the hell are you doing?" shouted the shocked blacksmith, shielding himself with his hand from the furious onslaught. The boy mentally calculated the process: to melt the iron with heart magic, raise the temperature, and burn off the gas and all impurities with wind. The air shook violently. A mad whirlwind of energy burst from the stone, forcing the blacksmith behind to shield himself from the unbearable heat. The magic with a roar sank into the ore. A blinding flash exploded right in the middle of the workshop. The giant barely stood on his feet, shielding his face from the powerful wave. A pillar of light and heat broke through the forge's walls, bursting far out into the street. The light began to fade rapidly. Only a sparkling haze remained in the space. The boy looked at the perfectly rectangular ingot hovering above his palms and casually asked the master's opinion. He calmly handed the black bar to the stunned giant. The rough fingers of the blacksmith gently trembled as they touched the metal. A tense silence hung in the air. The master stared at the bar, not believing his own eyes. In his hands was steel of impossible, absolute purity. The young man smiled happily and asked if he could now trust him with this job, instead of a usual response. The burly man rushed to his knees and slammed his forehead onto the floor, desperately begging to be allowed to forge. The boy was stunned. He recoiled sharply, staring in shock at the giant sprawled out before him. The master did not lift his head and continued to plead for the order, while the young man only fearfully denied it. The blacksmith was sweating from worry about the metal, while the boy was panicking nearby and urging Mr. Watts to get up. He clung to the powerful shoulders of the master, trying to forcibly pull him away from the stone floor. The young man couldn't stand it any longer and demanded that he simply get to work and stand up, and the man finally stopped bowing. Watts stood up, solemnly struck his fist against his chest, and requested to immediately sign the contract. His stern face relaxed into a warm, sincere smile. Meanwhile, outside, the cat calmly watched as thick smoke billowed from the forge's chimney. Suddenly, the young man became embarrassed upon hearing a completely unexpected remark. Without waiting for explanations, he nervously laughed, waved his hand, and tried to escape as quickly as possible. The blacksmith stopped him, explaining that he meant something entirely different. Rian warmly introduced himself himself, and the bearded blacksmith broke into a smile, pleased with the reasonable customer. Darkness, a momentary stupor. The young man incredulously asked again, refusing to believe what he had heard. The master casually pointed to the giant mountain of ore. He will not start working until Rain personally turns all that iron into steel. The blacksmith smiled good-naturedly, while the boy tried to grasp the scale of the problem. A nervous smile froze on Ryan's face. He just wanted a peaceful life. And outside, a fluffy creature lazily scratched its ear, ironically noting that their troubles were becoming more and more numerous. The heavy hoe struck the ground with a swing. The work was in full swing. Before the father and son lay an immense, perfectly cleared emptiness. Zdorovany proudly declared that soon this dead land will transform into rich farmland. Rian stared at the workers in amazement, admitting that he still couldn't believe it. One of the men showed a ripe fruit and promised to establish large-scale crop rotation this year. The boy eagerly started outlining a 3-year harvest plan, but his father suddenly interrupted him. He chuckled good-naturedly and pointed out his son's strange pronunciation. The rain internally cooled from its slight prick. He completely forgot that the local grains have different names, so he hurriedly changed the subject. Now the boy bombarded his father with grand plans for the development of residential areas for the future population. He demanded new tools, trade routes, and huge warehouses as if from a machine gun. The father was sweating from such pressure, feverishly thinking about where to find so many tenant farmers for this scale. Rain was meanwhile shining with an innocent smile. Although he was secretly rubbing his hands together, his cunning plan for a carefree life behind the strong father had just begun. "Stop! You can't do everything at once." The father couldn't hold back and shouted. Rian usually looked up at his father from below. Their peaceful conversation was interrupted by a carriage on the horizon. Inside the crew, a young man in armor was bored, looking down on the landscape and mentally calling these lands a provincial whole. The wheels rumbled loudly on the road. When the carriage stopped, it became clear that the capital tax inspector had arrived. Father frowned because he did not expect guests so early. He immediately felt uneasy. It smelled like a serious tax increase. While the boy was working hard at the construction site, reports on their progress regularly flowed straight to the capital. The news about the new fees shocked both of them. The door opened. A guest had already settled comfortably on the sofa. Sharp movement. As soon as Ryan and his father crossed the threshold, they were scolded for being late. Vincent Greatwall, the second son of the Marquis, stood up, simply furious about the wasted time. With an icy gaze, the aristocrat cut in that his family has held tightly in its grip all the finances of the kingdom for many generations. The blonde in armor collapsed on the sofa and abruptly cut off the polite greetings of the host. He arrived under direct royal order to assess the taxes. The long-haired baron forced a friendly smile, although he immediately felt that this inspector was extremely dangerous. The guest coldly remarked that all calculations were already prepared, thanks to the previously collected land maps. And he announced the verdict. From now on, the House of Proudlords will pay 500 gold coins in conventional currency. This amounted to a staggering 50 million yen. The young man paled next to the baron, realizing the catastrophe. The tax had skyrocketed for lands that had not even been settled yet. 500 gold coins? The inspector clasped his fingers together and asked in an icy tone if they had any problems with that. The baron panicked as the amount had increased tenfold. The blonde arrogantly quoted the law. The tax is levied on all arable land, and the landowners were well aware of this. The long-haired man desperately pleaded to postpone the assessment at least until the first harvest, calling the inspector's figures mere forecasts. But the guest harshly reminded that this land had not seen farming at all. His eyes narrowed into a predatory, merciless squint. The blonde placed his hand on the sword's hilt and coldly cut in that it was an order, not a suggestion. Any dissent was henceforth considered treason. The guest confidently spread his arms, demanding that his decisions be treated as royal decrees. True intoxication with power. The boy anxiously awaited his burly father's reaction to such audacity. However, the warrior merely bowed his head submissively. The safety of the family and the people was more important to him than his own pride. Yu smiled warmly. He quickly dropped to his knees, ready to demonstrate to the guest the full power of the perfect Japanese dojeza. The parental ability to yield to a bully became a real lesson for him. Suddenly, a girl with a teddy bear and a tray of tea joyfully entered the room. She was noticeably nervous, but she she tried her best to hold herself with dignity. The boy froze, touched by her efforts. The girl awkwardly curtsied and introduced herself as Elizabeth Proudlord. The happy girl warmly offered the guest a cup of tea. The man in armor struck at close range, and the porcelain with a chime flew away towards the teddy bear. He indifferently lowered his palm while the little girl looked on in shock at the spilled puddle. Her eyes filled with tears. The girl whispered that her mom tried so hard and helplessly reached for the toy. She desperately pressed the bear to herself, hiding her face from the abuser. Suddenly, the leftover tea splashed on her. She let out a pitiful cry, drinking arrogantly from the teapot. The guest asked in an icy tone who had even allowed her to speak. His face was twisted with anger, oppressive shadow. Silence. Suddenly, the knight threw back his head and laughed hysterically. With a maniacal grin, he spat that this pathetic brew was tasteless and colorless, worse than slop. The inspector added that such dirt perfectly suits her cheap outfit. The girl cried bitterly, and an angry local lord burst into the room and yanked the wrongdoer by his cloak, to which he only responded with a contemptuous retort. The inspector was furious, not believing that some petty noble dared to contradict him. The young man rushed forward, shielding his frightened younger sister with his body. The enemy coldly advised them to be glad that he had not yet taken their heads with his sword. Someone sharply ordered Reina to retreat, but the boy only saw the little one's tears. A sudden occurrence. A black shadow pierced the air right in front of Ray's face with a frightened gasp. Complete shock. A second of tense silence. The young man's eyes blazed with rage, and he burst into a scream, cursing the bastard who made his sister cry. Rian stared grimly straight ahead. He was confronted by a tall knight in heavy armor. A tense silence settled in. The boy shielded the man with a small girl in his arms, who were fearfully huddled against the door. The inspector angrily pointed his finger at Ryan, threatening punishment for such audacity. At that moment, the boy sprang from his place, leaving a deep crack in the floor. The man cried out his name in despair. He instinctively held the child closer to himself. The man begged the boy to hold back and not accidentally harm the civil servant. At such words, the inspector turned pale, and a cold sweat rolled down his cheek. The humiliated knight burst into a scream and declared that he would kill the scoundrel not as an ordinary tax collector, but as an elite royal warrior. He swung, and a massive ice blade burst from his hand with a crack. Deadly magic surged forward with a roar. Rian met the attack with an absolutely calm, cold gaze. The armored hand sharply swung, releasing an icy arrow. The space ahead was torn apart by a massive black strike. The boy's gaze sharpened. Dark energy crashed into the floor with a roar. A sinister flash erupted right behind the young man. A predatory smile appeared on someone else's lips. Lightning dash. The boy stood firmly on his feet. He looked around in surprise. An arrow whistled and embedded itself in the wall just a millimeter from his head. The enemy roared furiously. The figure of the knight was enveloped in a dark aura. He muttered grimly that now he was truly enraged. A heavy boot kicked angrily at the puddle in response to the cries about underhanded tricks. The young man simply smiled innocently and followed up with the question, wasn't he angry all this time? The knight grimly asked what was so funny, to which the young man merely apologized carelessly. The inspector's eyes flashed with fury at the edge of a sword. He promised the scoundrel death. The image burned the man from the inside. The boy with a smile apologized once more, while the knight clenched the hilt to the point of cracking. Suddenly, the space around the young man boiled with madness, and he began to summon the icy hell. Dark energy enveloped the blade. The young man calmly raised his sword to his face and commanded the magic to tear the enemy's throat. The window panes trembled slightly. In the library, the elf suddenly raised her head, sensing an abnormal surge of power. "Ice hell, Cositus," the boy said sharply. A deafening roar echoed. The shockwave surged forward. The air sliced through with a whistle. The boy unleashed a destructive whirlwind of magical blades, the power of which made the nearby girls barely manage to drop to the ground. The boy sharply pointed his finger at the stunned knight with a drawn sword, protecting the crying girl. Clenching his teeth, the boy burst forth with a bright aura, preparing to take on the fight. The distorted knight sprang from his place and charged straight at him. A ringing strike. A young man wedged himself between them and firmly stopped the steel blade with an ordinary wooden sword. The attacker's face twisted with tension and anger. The young man looked at him with an absolutely calm gaze, holding the weight of the weapon with the slightest slightest effort. Suddenly, the knight's eyes widened in wild terror. Covered in cold sweat, he began to back away helplessly. A sudden push threw the armored warrior all the way onto the couch. The young man slowly moved towards the trembling enemy. He had to answer for little Ellie's tears. His confident steps echoed in the room. A cold verdict rang out. For this, he will pay in full. Suddenly, the hero smiled warmly and asked the terrified knight if he was good at collecting taxes. The wooden blade ominously stopped just a centimeter from the enemy's face. Sharp turn. The knight was stunned by the unexpected maneuver. He nervously backed away, sweating profusely. Right before his face, a perfectly sharpened blade glinted threateningly. With a chilling calmness, the young man noted that he could cut them down completely. He carelessly hinted at the loss of hands, making his opponent tremble with fear. And then he added business like that during the spells. The mage uses a completely different zone the most. He cheerfully poked his finger at the knight's throat, asking if he preferred his throat over his hands. He exclaimed in confusion, not understanding what it was all about. Meanwhile, the young man was innocently sitting on the ground, barely holding the heavy sword, and asked for permission to ask something unusual. His gaze stopped on the blade. He slowly began to speak about metal cooled to absolute zero, and with a wide smile, he peeked out from behind the blade, waiting for a reaction. Smiling, he almost whispered to ask if Rain guessed what he was hinting at. Rian squinted intently, asking what would happen to the material next. He calmly explained the principle of thermal shock. Heating expands an object, while rapid cooling sharply compresses it. The structure simply cannot withstand the stress. The boy asked what would happen if the object turned out to be a sword. The knight turned pale and broke out in a sweat while listening to the theory about extreme temperature drop. Here's what's happening. Rain calmly held the blade that was already sparking from the difference. He lightly touched the steel with his finger. At the slightest touch, the sword shattered into pieces with a crack. With a terrifying smile, the boy suggested testing this effect on a living body. Sharp fragments fell to the ground. The knight's nerves gave out. Foaming at the mouth, he fell on his back. Rian turned to his shocked companions with an innocent, angelic smile. The defeated opponent remained lying on the floor unconscious. The luxurious mansion stood in the midst of a dense forest. The man in light armor lay helplessly sprawled on the floor, while the small one leaned over him with concern. Somewhere far away, the crowns of trees rustled peacefully under the cloudy sky. Right there, among the giant trunks, was hidden an entire forest settlement with neat little houses right on the branches. Opening his eyes wide, he suddenly sat up in bed, frantically trying to remember the recent events. The Proudlord's family stood quietly around little Rainford. It seemed he had indeed been left alive. He was officially informed that he had fainted from exhaustion, delicately glossing over their recent deadly conflict. The memory of Rainsford's terrible aura still grated on his nerves. At that time, he was sincerely preparing to die at the hands of that child. He clenched the blanket before the whitening of the bones, recalling his absolute defeat before a force for which his magic was merely a toy. But at dinner, the Proudlords unexpectedly surrounded him with such familial warmth that he had never seen in his own cold marquee house. The ordinary tomato turned out to be so sweet that it made his eyes bulge, and Rainford happily explained, "This is the result of his water magic." The mind of a 10-year-old boy was frankly frightening. He was throwing around adult terms and easily maneuvering through progressive tax schemes. Since his old sword disappeared after the battle, his family gifted him a new one, forged by a local blacksmith from exceptionally pure steel. The metal sparkled like the night sky. Sudden flash. He decided to make the easiest test swing, simply checking the balance of the blade. With one movement, the earth was torn apart by a gigantic crystalline explosion, and he turned pale, realizing that with such magical weaponry, it was better not to confront humans. But he lacked the courage to admit to Rainsford that the gift had turned out to be too dangerous. After a whole day of exhausting debates about the fate of the territories, Vincent set aside the issue of taxes and collapsed into bed, exhausted. Night. The branches of the trees barely loomed in the darkness. Deafening silence. The estate was soundly asleep. In the morning, the workers were loading the carriage with boxes of tomatoes, and Ellie, blushing deeply, wished Vincent a safe journey home. She timidly offered him a plucked flower, causing the knight to blush in confusion. He was touched by her holy kindness. Despite his past behavior, she left a lily by his bed, granting him a peaceful sleep. Vincent bowed his head, sincerely sincerely apologized for his actions and warmly thanked Lady Ellie. Looking out the window, he noted in his diary his revelation: the past Vincent had died. From now on, he would start from scratch and serve people like a true knight. Thus, several months passed. Sitting on the stairs, the girl contemplated success. Years of mastering the wilderness had finally come to an end, and now her father had gone to the capital for the royal award. Life was rolling along its usual course. Every morning, Reina was joyfully greeted by his large, fluffy companion. For the successful mastery of the wasteland, the family was honored, and the king had invited the father to him, so he was away. As soon as the guest realized that he was not going to be killed, the tension at the table instantly eased. It turned out that after waking up, Vincent was constantly waiting for retribution. The affairs were settled quickly. The knight surveyed the lands and froze taxes for their experimental farm. He promised to return soon because he has become addicted to the local tomatoes. As a farewell, the guys casually handed him a replacement for the lost sword. Vincent took the blade with a painfully serious, stone face. Overall, the visit ended on a warm note, and the guest even apologized to Ellie. And it was in vain that he stressed about the weapon. That magical sword was just something they forged for fun with Watts. An empty void stretched around. Suddenly, the young man's face darkened. He never forgave Vincent for those cheap flirtations with his girlfriend. Shaking off these thoughts, he raced through the forest on the giant Shiro. The noble title provided perfect excuses. Disguised as fictitious inspections, he calmly ignored the tedious receptions in the capital. The sun was quickly sinking towards the horizon, while the fluffy creature relentlessly carried it forward. The boy raced through the forest on the back of a huge fluffy wolf. He smiled carelessly and began to speak, but the beast suddenly jerked sharply. "Hey, Shiro, wait!" shouted the young man, barely holding on to the fur. The beast charged forward, and its rider froze in surprise, having spotted something ahead. In the midst of the thicket stood an elf, surrounded by a tight circle of wild wolves. She tensed up. The girl was exhausted and wounded. Blood was dripping down her face, and her hand was convulsively pressing against her bruised shoulder. The boy opened his eyes in shock. The elf mentally cursed the worst moment for an ambush, when suddenly a young man jumped out of the bushes and commanded his beast to come closer for the spell. Shiro let out a deafening roar, and with a powerful leap burst into the epicenter of the battle. Hostile predators were stunned as they bared their teeth at the sudden rumble. The ground shook heavily under the massive paws, causing the elf to recoil. The young man just smiled confidently and defiantly. At that moment, a powerful surge of magic struck the clearing, sweeping everything in its path. The boy, with a happy smile, tightly hugged the huge white beast, burying himself in its thick fur. "It was awesome! Well done, Shiro," he joyfully praised his fluffy friend. Suddenly, an injured elf appeared beside him, causing him to falter in confusion. He asked worriedly if everything was okay, but the girl sharply raised her hand, commanding the person to stay away. Blood was trickling down her cheek, and her gaze was so tense and hostile that the boy recoiled. The elf girl stared at him in shock, demanding an explanation of how a mere mortal came to possess a real Fenrir. And the legendary fearsome monster simply tilted its head amusingly and barked innocently. He always heard that the legendary Fenrir is a terrifying beast that howls at the full moon. The boy recalled the illustrations from old books, but reality turned out to be much more comical. Sitting in front of him was a gigantic fluffy giant. The so-called terrible monster blinked trustingly with its round eyes. An awkward silence hung in the air. Suddenly, the scream of the wounded elf girl shattered the peace. The girl was furious at his pitying gaze, to which the boy confusedly asked if perhaps a wolf had bitten her on the head. His gaze fell on the deep, bloody wound on her shoulder. The young man calmly noted that the injury looked bad, but in response, he received only an aggressive order to be quiet. While the wolf contentedly licked the face of his new friend, the girl continued to scream hysterically about treacherous traps. Instead of pointless arguments, the boy simply raised his hand to the sky, and the space erupted with powerful magical light. The elf girl froze. He advised her in a mundane tone to stay calm until the bleeding stopped completely. Having completed the quick treatment, the young man gently patted his companion. The girl was shocked to realize that powerful magic had worked without any spell, while the boy easily jumped onto the beast's back. He assured her that he had no intention of harming her, and peacefully rode away on the fluffy giant. The elf girl hesitantly fidgeted, biting her lip. The boy had already set off on his giant wolf when she suddenly called out to him. The rider stopped. Breathing heavily, she asked to wait. Her gaze became pleading. The girl confessed. During the reconnaissance, a beast attacked her, and while the others managed to retreat, she simply couldn't escape. The elf girl stopped and awkwardly raised her hand. She sincerely apologized for being rude to her rescuer. Now they walked side by side, and the girl quietly spoke, understanding that due to his young age, the boy did not know many things. She thanked him in the name of the forest spirits, but the young man was troubled by something else. He directly asked what had caused her recent alarm. The memories pierced with pain. She spoke about the horrors and humiliations that their women and children had to endure. After all, it was once people who captured elves and shackled them with slave collars. The elf confessed, in the past, people used her kind as instruments of war, leaving only pain and rage in their wake. From a young age, she was taught that the human race is made up of savages, but today's actions of the boy proved otherwise. Continuing his way through the forest, Rain realized that he still hadn't introduced himself. The girl with the warm smile thanked him once again. He proudly introduced himself as Rainford Proudlord, the son of a baron tasked with overseeing this forest. The elf introduced herself as Rhea. They solidified their acquaintance with a friendly handshake. Suddenly, Rain calculated their route and tensed up. It was long past time for him to return home. He stopped and asked why they were moving away from the exit. Rhea calmly looked around and stated that they were heading to her settlement. Rian froze in place from surprise. Grabbing onto the trunk of the tree, he panicked and refused. His strict mother would simply destroy him for being late. Rhea called him by name in confusion. Peering from behind the tree, Rain nervously suggested postponing the visit until tomorrow, and she agreed with a smile. Rhea playfully asked to skip the formalities, and at that moment forcefully threw Rain forward. The air sliced through with a whistle. The boy flew straight into the giant trunk with a scream. The tree was rapidly approaching, but instead of a fatal blow, he smoothly passed through the crust, which parted in soft, watery circles. Barrier magic, Rain realized in shock. The boy fell out of the illusion. He hit the ground hard, barely managing to roll into a ball. Looking up, he saw wooden houses built right on thick branches. Rain froze. Before him lay a secret settlement of elves. I couldn't enjoy the view. My neck was suddenly burned by the cold of the crossed spears. Rhea rushed to intercept the guards, desperately protecting her rescuer. But the angry elves did not listen and cried out for reinforcements, ready to kill a human on the spot. The tension was cut by the whistle of the bowstring. An unknown archer released an arrow that viciously embedded itself in the ground just a millimeter from Rain's face. The boy was calmly sitting on the ground when an arrow suddenly flew into his face. The ringing clatter of metal. The shining dome securely covered the young man, while the giant Fenrir fiercely bared its teeth at the armed squad. The attackers froze, staring in shock at the broken arrows. Recognizing the sacred beast, they were horrified when suddenly little Lulu desperately shouted to stop the attack. The tall elf Rhea immediately jumped forward and shielded the person with her body. She begged her tribesmen to believe her, but the crowd only whispered suspiciously. The elves did not trust humans and believed that the lady had simply brainwashed them. Suddenly, a quick thud was heard. The tearful girl rushed to Lulu with hugs, endlessly happy that she had returned alive. From the crowd emerged a tall leader who coldly reprimanded the warriors for attacking the savior. The peasants hurriedly stammered, trying to justify themselves, but she ordered everyone to be quiet. The woman approached the guy and sincerely apologized for the rudeness of her people. At that moment, all the warriors of the tribe obediently fell to their knees before him. He was stunned. The woman in front of him turned out to be an exact copy of Rhea. Two elf maidens were carefully examining the unexpected guest. A full cup gently landed on the table with a light thud. The boy awkwardly shrank in his chair, surrounded by three hostesses. The fresh tea looked too appetizing. He mentally scolded himself for simply succumbing to the circumstances and now had no idea what he would say at home. Cautious sip. The eyes widened from the unexpected taste. The subtle sweetness and fresh aroma without a cloying aftertaste instantly captivated him. The elf girl smiled gently, pleased with such a reaction. Suddenly, a cold question rang out. Why is he not afraid of finding poison in the tea? The boy just smiled sincerely. He could not suspect his girlfriend's fellow villagers. Although on the way here he felt the heavy hatred of the elves towards humans on his back, even with the protection of the divine beast. fist. But now he simply continued to hold the warm cup calmly. The elf cheerfully waved away the warnings, asking if anyone could really get hurt. In the silence, someone swallowed hard. Rhea burst into a bright laugh, causing the young man to blink in confusion. He only smiled awkwardly, recalling his past life as a clerk. Few are capable of backing thoughts with real actions. Rhea leaned sharply towards his face, suspecting something was wrong. For a human child, he was behaving too maturely. Her older companion sighed and pulled the girl back, asking her to stop these jokes. The conversation was interrupted by the appearance of a dignified elf, Rhea's grandmother and the village elder Rainford Proudlord. She looked closely at the guest and respectfully thanked him for saving her granddaughter. The young man nervously waved his hands, assuring that it was not him who dispersed the gang, but Shiro. But Rainford did not believe in such modesty and suggested sitting down at the table for a serious conversation. The elder reported alarming news. Forest wolves have never approached the village so closely, and the number of magical beasts has started to grow abnormally. It seems that something much more powerful has awakened deep in the thicket. Hearing about the new dangerous monster, the guy immediately tensed up. It turned out that the cause of the alarm was an ancient dragon. The boy cautiously asked about the ancient dragon, and the elf grimly confirmed his suspicion. An unbearably heavy atmosphere suddenly hung in the room. The tension pressed from all sides, even though it was just a conversation. He nervously smiled and tried to downplay everything as a joke, as if to say it sounds cool. Although inside, the guy was sweating as if he were justifying himself again to an angry client. The elf's gaze instantly turned icy. If only the problem were just in the cool name. Carefully choosing his words, he asked if these creatures usually sleep at all. In response, she referred to the ancient legends of her ancestors. Upon hearing this, the boy nearly burst into tears. It turned out that the monster had fallen asleep in the heart of the forest 2,000 years ago. According to legends, after 3 millennia of slumber, the beast was to awaken and plunge the world into an unprecedented crisis. Now it is clear why there was not a single word about this in the parental library. It was stubbornly pouring rain outside. They listened silently to the sound of the rain. The rain was pouring down, and a tense silence stretched out as everyone contemplated what they had heard. The boy smiled nervously. The scale of the threat just didn't fit in his head. Confused, he whispered that it felt like the end of the world. He shifted his gaze to the interlocutors and cautiously inquired whether it was not too early for the apocalypse, somewhere around a whole 1,000 years. A tense silence hung in the air, making the boy uneasy, and he quickly tried to attribute everything to the inaccuracies of ancient legends. The great fluffy beast suddenly burst out laughing loudly, and the elf openly admitted they themselves do not know the truth. With a slight sadness, she explained that their knowledge was based only on fragmented stone chronicles, which is why such a huge time gap caught everyone by surprise. The boy thoughtfully rubbed his chin, asking Rain what could have caused this malfunction. The riddle would not let him rest. Rain tensed and tightly clasped her hands together. Why had the destroyer of the world awakened a millennium early? The boy eagerly began to propose theories. Someone could have stolen the seal, broken the hidden crystal, or the elves themselves could have seriously messed up somewhere. Rian only awkwardly smiled and looked away at such a bold assumption. She quickly assured that there was simply no one in the village with such power, but immediately shifted the topic to another troubling news, the appearance of the Orc King. This monster was a mutant, a true walking disaster, and they noticed this creature just recently, right near their settlement. The elf bitterly acknowledged that their people could never withstand such a threat. The only solution was to build a giant barrier to protect the village from danger. The elf explained the actions of little Lulu. Her father was maimed by a mad beast, so the girl desperately went into the forest alone to gather healing herbs. It was there that Fenrir attacked her, from which the child was barely saved. Suddenly, the woman raised her index finger, warning that what followed would be only her personal guesses. She hesitantly began to share her thoughts. The words hung in the air. Silence. In the complete darkness, magical sparks flickered. The tension was rapidly escalating, and the final conclusion was pronounced. The sleeping dragon awoke not by chance. It was a direct reaction to the flare of some colossal power. The boy's eyes widened sharply in shocking realization. The boy crossed his arms over his chest and thoughtfully said that now everything is falling into place. He understood that a single orc king could not have stirred up such a mess, and he was already mentally searching for the true culprit. Anger was boiling rapidly. angrily. This damned bastard. However, the elf women suddenly interrupted him, hastily assuring that he was mistaken. The boy blinked in confusion, not understanding why they were staring at him so strangely. The gaze fell on the fluffy creature under the table. It turned out that it reacted only to the immense magical power, and everything became clear instantly. He awkwardly laughed, realizing how difficult it had been for them to tell him this to his face. The girls blushed deeply, shocked that he understood everything. He just smiled conciliatorily. Their hints were more than enough. When the conversation returned to the matter, the elves sighed resignedly. They had no concrete leads left. Then he asked the main question: is there any weapon against dragons in their ancient legends? The friends fell silent anxiously. The elf girl helplessly shrugged her shoulders and described a true horror. No blade can pierce the scales, the jaws crush the ground, and the dragon's flame leaves behind only dead ash. The boy leaned heavily on the table, feverishly wondering if they had even the slightest chance of defeating such a monster in direct combat. The elf described the dragon with horror: impenetrable scales, devastating jaws, and flames that incinerate everything to ashes. She admitted that in all her long years, she had never met anyone who could defeat him. Suddenly, the little one raised his finger and suggested simply talking to the monster. He sat down at the table, rubbed his chin, and firmly decided to act according to this plan. The elf girl asked hopefully if he really had any idea. The boy joyfully confirmed his intention to go to the dragon, which made the girls break out in a cold sweat. In a fit of hysteria, they shrieked for him to talk to him himself. An awkward silence hung in the air. The girls were heavily catching their breath from the shouting, while the large white dog just stared in confusion. The boy stood frozen in confusion. The elves abruptly turned away, pretending to whistle, and shamelessly declared that there was no one else to go. He pointed at himself in shock, realizing that he had just been sent to certain death. "I'm just an ordinary, sweet 10-year-old boy," he cried in panic, looking at his friend's blank face. But his desperate cries drowned in absolute indifference. The boy continued to desperately wave his arms, insisting that he was just an ordinary child. The elf girl looked seriously at Rein and began her report. She listed the giant craters and lakes found in the forest, causing the boy to nervously flinch. The mention of the battered earthen walls made him sweat even more. The words about the wild surge of magic finally revealed the cards. Before Rein's eyes, their destructive training flashed immediately. There are no doubts left, as it was this magical flash that awakened the sleeping dragon. The girl ironically raised her finger, quoting a report about the emergence of anomalous power in the world. Rein resignedly slammed his face onto the table, realizing that he could not avoid the fight. Gathering his courage, he cautiously asked about the monster's dimensions. The partner sternly asked if he had any excuse at all, but the boy just looked away guiltily, placing a finger to her lips. The elf tried to recall the details. Her response was shocking. The dragon was so huge that it could completely cover an entire settlement. A drop fell from the leaf, and Rein noticed that the rain was finally subsiding. The elf in the cloak turned away, entrusting the boy to come up with some kind of plan as well. It was already late, so they decided to postpone the conversation until tomorrow. A heavy hand encouragingly rested on Reina's shoulder. He was relied upon. The moon peeked through the clouds, and the boy had no idea where to start. He stretched his shoulders and decided to come up with at least something for starters. Rein and Ria walked leisurely along the rocky path. The boy casually asked the girl to find him some shed for an overnight stay with Shiro. Ria suddenly stopped and looked at him in shock. She was sincerely outraged by such a request and scolded the guy, directly suggesting he come to her. Her cheeks flushed slightly when she quietly asked if he really didn't want to stay with her, which made Rein blush. Chaos reigned in his head the very first night in this world and immediately at the girl's home. Rein mumbled that he didn't want to trouble her relatives, but Ria calmly replied that her family had long been exterminated by people, taken into slavery through magic, and thrown into war. She smiled gently, assuring that he would disturb no one in her empty house. Rein froze in horror upon learning that elves were taken into slavery and thrown to their deaths in wars solely because of their magic. In the middle of the forest path, Ria stopped and quietly apologized. She smiled softly and admitted that thanks to him she understood that people can be different. She would have hated him along with everyone else, considering him just another cruel outsider, but he saved her life. Suddenly, the girl sharply waved her hand. Rain blinked in confusion. The elf girl spread her arms wide towards the moonlight. Her parents were gone, but now every villager had become her family. She gently asked the boy to wipe the sadness off his face. Ria confidently promised to be his personal shield against those who still did not trust people. At such words, Reina's cheeks instantly flushed. The elf girl also became terribly embarrassed and began to awkwardly confess her feelings until the romance was interrupted by a sharp child's scream. Little Lulu rushed into her arms, and Ria joyfully embraced the girl, forgetting about the awkwardness. The kids explained that they went for a walk so late because Dad wanted to stretch so that his body wouldn't stiffen up. Ria smiled warmly and gently waved away the thanks for taking care of Lulu. Rain blinked in surprise. When the stranger noticed the little one, the elf girl shyly turned away and muttered that he should be thanked too. A sturdy man with a wooden prosthetic leg emerged from the shadows. Rian awkwardly scratched the back of his head, justifying that he and Shiro simply ended up next to each other. He didn't have time to finish speaking. Ria suddenly leaned in and stunned him with the statement that she was already 52 years old. She took it upon herself to teach the boy that wandering in the forest at 10 years old is too dangerous. The elf girl smugly raised her nose, but Rain immediately shattered her pride. By that logic, she was also 10. The boy jerked forward indignantly. Everything fell into place. The cunning elf was simply hiding her real age behind the status of older sister. Ria burst with anger at the rude human children, but Rain, with a victorious smile, finished her off. No matter how old she is, she behaves like a child, and this is typical demagoguery. They clashed foreheads, shooting lightning bolts at each other with their gazes. Suddenly, someone's heavy hand interrupted their argument. The blonde little elf threw at Reina, who, although grateful for Ria's rescue, should not get too cocky around people here. While the girl shyly hid behind, the little boy disdainfully added that she shouldn't associate with such nobodies. An adult elf, with a scar on his face, approached from the side and sharply remarked that he despises the human race. Ria immediately stepped between them, pleading with the man to back off and not touch the young man who had saved her life. Another elf carefully supported the injured man and decided to take the locals away. She smiled warmly at Ria as a farewell. Left alone with Rain, Ria lowered her head and quietly apologized for the confrontation. As he left, Lars still muttered a curse after the stranger. The girl sadly followed their gaze and explained, "The man with the scar is the hunter Lars, maimed by a magical beast. Elvish hatred towards humans has taken too strong a root in this village." With pain in her voice, Ria confessed how much her own helplessness tears her apart. She clenched her fist until her knuckles turned white. The broken body chained Lars to the crutches, so he simply poured out his despair on Reina. But Ria's gaze ignited with determination. If the dragon comes, she will defend the village to the last, even if her head is crushed or she is burned alive. With tears in her eyes, Ria confessed, she is terrified of losing her new friends, who have become her family, just as she once lost her parents. Rian exclaimed her name in shock. The boy rushed to bandage her wound, ignoring the girl's pleas to take care of himself as he was bleeding himself. She looked at him in surprise. Rain asked if many more peasants had suffered, to which the elf confirmed that there were plenty of wounded. Lowering his gaze, he asked to gather them all in one place, which greatly puzzled Ria. With a tense face, the boy begged her to trust him. For the gathering, a spacious night glade was prepared, illuminated by torches. In the darkness, the silhouettes of dozens of battered residents stretched toward the improvised stage. Rian stepped forward decisively. In the crowd, an irritated murmur grew. The elves did not understand why the human child had pulled them from their home in the middle of the night, when the wounds throbbed the hardest. The boy stepped onto the platform in front of the disgruntled villagers and loudly apologized for disturbing them at such a time. He stood before them with outstretched arms, ready to hear any complaints. While Ria anxiously doubted his plan, angry shouts demanding to throw Fenrir out and leave the village were already coming from the crowd. The elves asked irritably what exactly he was planning to do with them. The boy just smiled carefreely, calming Ria. The elf, bound by an unknown force, screamed that the girl was being manipulated and threatened to throw the outsider away if he could move. Instead, the guy winked at the confused Ria and stated that he just wanted to peacefully resolve their little neighborhood problem. This only angered the elves. One of them shouted that the pathetic human should not dare to interfere in the management management of their forest. Then the young man calmly stood before the crowd and announced that he was the eldest son of the Baron, to whom the kingdom had entrusted the oversight of this territory. He politely cleared his throat and introduced himself as Rainford Proudlord. From the crowd, fierce calls immediately poured in to tear the little one apart and make him a bloody example for the rest of the people. The elves erupted with curses, refusing to acknowledge human laws, yet Rainford calmly continued to speak. Suddenly, the screamers fell silent in confusion. Rainford coldly remarked that he understood their feelings, while around him a wild magic of the wind began to swirl. His gaze became icy. A giant black wolf emerged from behind the boy, causing the elves to scream in terror. They immediately recognized in him the divine beast, Fenrir, and now their anger instantly turned into animal panic. The white beast bared its fangs menacingly, growling hoarsely at the outstretched hand. "Shiro," a voice calmly called out, ignoring the wolf's fury. The young man cheerfully winked and issued a brief dossier. "He is Rainford Proudlord. He is 26, and he is from Earth." Someone invisible asked in surprise what this sudden acquaintance was about. The reason turned out to be simple. Although the goddess herself once gifted this audacious provincial with magic, things were now dire. Rainford stood before the gigantic spiked dragon and understood perfectly. If he didn't speak out now, while he still breathed, there would be no other chance. A nervous, doomed smile froze on his face. Nearby, the elf girl was nervously blinking when a ghostly voice echoed from the pulsating black aura, urging them to hurry. The boy flinched at the sharp cry of the impatient entity. The gloom aggressively expanded, hungrily demanding food. The dragon fiercely opened its jaws, and the shadow solemnly proclaimed that it was time to fulfill the ancient pact. The monster slowly turned its head towards the tiny elder of the elves. The girl froze in confusion, and then she sincerely exclaimed that she had no idea what it was all about. Someone awkwardly lowered their head, suddenly recalling the contract, as if it were some ancient and completely insignificant trifle. The elf calmly stepped forward. She cynically told the dragon that the terms of their pact from 2,000 years ago had long faded from memory. She was abruptly interrupted by the heavy voice of the beast. It had just sensed a huge surge of magic nearby. "Enough with the jokes," roared the dragon. His roar dissolved in the starry sky. A thick black aura filled the space. The boy's eyes widened with a chilling realization. The dragon hovered over the company and coldly announced, "The source of this magic will make a perfect offering." The elf girl quickly oriented herself. She put on a nervous smile and without a hint of shame turned in the guy. He mentally erupted into a selection of curses at such a vile betrayal. A tense pause has arrived. The beast lowered its snout to the ground, scrutinizing the victim that the elf had forcefully pushed forward. The dragon angrily rejected this worthless human offering, while the boy desperately yelled at his partner for the setup. But in a moment, the mighty lizard changed its tone. It discerned true otherworldly power in this small body. Rainford swallowed hard as someone's voice remarked in surprise, "All the boy's strength comes from the Fenrir cub on his back." The young man nervously smiled at the giant dragon on the cliff, stated his name, and politely asked not to be eaten. Instead, a giant maw opened wide in the frame, fiercely accusing him of violating an ancient sacred pact. The monster coldly cut off that it does not care at all about the pitiful problems of small creatures. Rainford and his two companions froze, looking like tiny insects before the absolute indifference of the lizard. A heavy clawed paw thudded against the ground, reinforcing a short threat in case of refusal. A high column of smoke and dust rose into the sky from the impact. The dragon ominously spread its wings and promised to first break the bones of the insolent one, and only then devour him. The boy's eyes widened instantly, with a sharp awareness of danger. He jerked back sharply. The only thought pulsating in my head was that a direct hit meant certain death. The space was torn apart by a lightning strike. Rainford barely managed to raise his hand in the block, hunching from the devastating force of the attack. The young man gritted his teeth, holding the block with all his might under the pressure of the devastating blow. The shockwave with a whistle sliced through the space. The ground beneath my feet cracked deeply from the insane force. The boy was thrown back like a rag doll. He harshly plowed through the bushes with his back, wincing in pain. He exhaled heavily. It was good that he managed to activate the magical shield, otherwise this force would have ground him to dust. Consciousness suddenly clouded, and the body was gripped by by a terrifying familiar sensation from a past life when it was hit by a truck. Complete darkness and only one thought: will he die again? Before his eyes flashed a new life that he had come to love so much, the rescued lands of the kingdom, loved ones, and pure delight from magic. Exhausted, he mentally said goodbye to his sister Ellie, feeling that this time he definitely wouldn't make it out. Suddenly, through the veil, the outline of a large eye emerged. A huge white muzzle leaned right over him. The boy was stunned and suddenly sat up. Next to him loomed a familiar giant wolf. He froze in surprise. The beast gently nudged him with its nose, and the boy sighed in relief, uttering the name of his fluffy friend, Shiro. The exhausted beast barely let out a whimper. The boy flinched and called his friend in fear. His trembling hands touched the fur of the heavily breathing Shiro. Sitting next to the wounded wolf, he bitterly realized, even in such a state, it still worries about him. Around lay only the ravaged wasteland of the explosion. Before my eyes, the blow flashed again. Shiro shielded him from falling with his own body. The first tears fell on the beast's paw, and the boy whispered, "Foolish, foolish Shiro." His fingers tightly clutched the white fur. He bitterly cried, realizing the price his friend paid for his life. The boy bit his lip tightly, suppressing despair. He quietly asked the wolf to stay in place and rest. A tough step forward, throwing aside any fear, he rushed straight towards the gigantic black dragon to put an end to the monster. Clenching the shining amulet, the boy grinned fiercely. There was nowhere to retreat, and it was no longer a matter of courage. The invisible enemy mocked. Enough whining. The offspring of Fenrir would never die from such a trifle. Anger flared in the boy's eyes. He suddenly thrust his hands forward, sending a glowing burst straight into the vortex of darkness. He shouted a curse at his opponent at the top of his lungs. A blow with a crack struck the jaw of the giant dragon. The space was torn apart by a colossal shockwave. The boy stared motionlessly at the wall of fire. The attack had definitely hit its target, but when the smoke cleared, the lizard was still standing on its feet. That was enough for victory. The monster in the hut bared its fangs. The monster rumbled that the human child turned out to be impressive, but instead of panicking, the boy calmly lit another sphere in his hand, causing the dragon to flinch. The beast stared in shock at the little one. The boy was casually sitting on the ground next to the exhausted knight and was explaining the plan in a mundane way. A sharp heat stroke would penetrate even the thickest armor. High above them, a new gigantic sphere of destructive energy was already forming. The giant dragon suddenly straightened up, unleashing a destructive shockwave. The force of the explosion instantly knocked the boy back. A massive stone block nearby cracked deeply, yet he stubbornly raised his gaze and promised that no one else would be harmed. With a slight smile on his battered face, he declared that he would not surrender either his home or his people. His eyes flashed with fury, and he burst into a scream, swearing to personally ensure the safety of his loved ones. The monster menacingly bared its teeth in response to the boy's threat to make it pay for everything it had done. The giant dragon opened its mouth, looming over the small boy. From a distance, two elf maidens watched them in fear. Rhea tensely confirmed her grandmother's suspicions. The boy shot up abruptly, releasing energy without a single word of incantation. Hard landing. The rain burst forth with an aura right before the claws of the monster, revealing an unfathomable number of its attributes. The elf's eye twitched from the sudden realization. An ordinary body would be torn to pieces, as even a higher race cannot merge two elements. But he crossed fire and ice without tension into a destructive mixed magic. The air trembled from the furious whirlwind. His dark silhouette radiated an abyssal ocean of mana, driving primal fear into the dragon's eyes. A bright flash struck the eyes. Women were petrified. Their picture of the magical world had just shattered completely. Rain stood triumphantly on the height, with an open book, like a true deity from ancient myths. The elf exclaimed in astonishment that it was too easy to lure out the ancient dragon. She whispered Rain's name with anxiety. The monster suddenly lifted its head. The air was shattered by a deafening roar. The boy was feverishly thinking. His magic of fire and ice wounded the beast, but did not kill it. A blinding beam of energy burst from the dragon's mouth. A realization flashed in Ryan's eyes. He understood exactly what needed to be done. He barely managed to dive behind the stone boulder, taking a devastating blow on it. The face contorted with tension. The stone ominously cracked. A wild exhaustion has set in. The mass treatment of people and the hard work in the fields before the battle have taken too much strength. Meanwhile, the dragon heavily stepped to the edge of the cliff, looming over its prey. The beast squinted menacingly, while the boy mentally counted the pitiful remnants of his mana. The giant monster mockingly growled that Rainford had no more options left. The boy smirked boldly and wiped his chin, not bothering to deny anything. The dragon roared with delight, sincerely appreciating such honesty. A magical circle began to form in the mouth of the monster. As a sign of respect, the monster decided to incinerate the enemy with its strongest move. The young man gritted his teeth, shielding his face from the fierce gust of wind. Suddenly, an unknown bolt struck from the sky right between them, causing the lizard to freeze in surprise before the blown-out crater. The boy stared in shock at the crowd of bewildered people who had just appeared out of thin air. A giant stone sphere crashed to the battlefield with a deafening roar. The ground around her instantly began to crack from the terrible tension. Amid all this chaos, the roof of someone's accidentally teleported house was even visible. The boy wearily watched this madness, already fully understanding who had disrupted his fight. At that moment, the space was sliced by a lightning flash. A massive black weapon with a swing struck directly into the monster. A colossal blow smashed the giant dragon's face into the dirt. The dragon opened its jaws, and magical energy began to swirl between its fangs. The ball of light rapidly gained strength. Giant magical circles flared up in the air before the monster. The boy turned pale suddenly. This attack resembled not an ordinary breath, but a unique deadly skill. Mana was being absorbed into the patterns at a crazy speed. The young man slapped himself on the cheeks, pushing away the panic. Any delay would cost him his life. He fell to his knees, urgently focusing on creating a multi-layered barrier. A wall made of several light shields instantly rose before him. Despite the animal fear of the attack, he reliably shielded the little companion with his body. Clenching his teeth, the boy silently vowed that he would not lose and would return to his family at any cost. At that moment, the dragon unleashed a colossal burst of energy. A blinding beam crashed through the defense with a terrifying roar. Everything around was engulfed by a white flash. The air was sliced by the swift movement of a dark mass. A destructive beam of energy pierced the magical shields behind which the boy was hiding. He tensed to the limit, desperately holding the defense, but the giant dragon merely bared its fangs fiercely. The enemy barrage struck with renewed force. Under intense pressure, the barrier cracked deeply. The boy sank heavily to his knee, feeling the mana rapidly depleting. He swore under his breath. The shield finally shattered with a flash, and he trembled in shock. The space suddenly filled with the dense magic of the wind. A furious whirlwind rose right before him, securely blocking the deadly blow. The air roared, swirling into an impenetrable wall. A gigantic white beast's face appeared behind him, and the boy exclaimed in disbelief, "Shiro!" A sob escaped from her chest, and tears of relief welled up in her eyes. "Let's go, Shiro!" shouted Rain, while the enemy opposite nervously broke out in a sweat. The opponent's body tensed, his eyes widened in horror. From the magical circle, a crocodile's jaws burst forth with a fierce roar. Rain gritted his teeth. His mana had partially recovered, but although the enemy's strength was also waning, there was still nothing to repel the attack. Suddenly, the figure of the boy was enveloped in an unexpected glow. He froze in surprise. A pillar of bright light struck the sky far behind. A desperate girl's scream echoed, and Raina realized someone was sharing mana with him. The elves focused their hands together. A whole crowd united in a common prayer, giving away the remnants of their energy. A grateful smile blossomed on the boy's face. In my imagination, a pure, endless blue sky appeared. The eyes sparkled with excitement again. It would be a crime to waste such an opportunity. High in the sky, inside giant clouds, trillions of ice particles were constantly colliding. They were rapidly picked up by powerful updrafts. The ice crystals soared higher and higher, wildly colliding with each other and accumulating charge. And this entire electrified mass has not yet fallen to the ground. In the darkness, a threatening spark flickered. The dragon puzzledly raised its snout, not understanding what its small opponent was up to. At that moment, the heavens opened up with a hail of shining arrows that flew straight at the monster. The young man's voice calmly stated that the lizard's skin is extremely strong. His body was as hard as stone. The beast watched the light with primal terror, wondering if these were heavenly arrows falling upon him. The boy grinned predatorily and issued the verdict. "It is this steel armor that will now become become the creature's deadly weakness. With a deafening cry, he unleashed a colossal pillar of lightning upon the reptile. A blinding electric discharge pierced through the space. The destructive energy of the impact instantly engulfed everything around. A powerful explosion tore through space, striking with dozens of blinding flashes. A thick cloud of dust covered the land, and in this silence, the name Reina was barely heard. The elf girl covered her face from the fierce wind, anxiously trying to see the dragon through the smoke. Suddenly, her eyes widened in horror. She reached out her trembling hand forward in despair. Raising her voice, the girl rushed to help and suddenly froze. Rain was completely unharmed, sitting on the glade and waving his hand cheerfully, comfortably settled next to a gigantic sleeping beast. Rian wearily sprawled on the grass next to the giant fluffy beast. The boy simply smiled joyfully at the sky, enjoying the long-awaited rest. Suddenly, Rhea came crashing down on him with a loud scream. Overwhelmed and confused, Ryan barely managed to say that the girl was too much for him. However, she only clung tighter to his shirt, rejoicing through tears that he had survived. Their figures were lost against the backdrop of the fallen dragon's ink. The boy himself did not understand how he survived this slaughter without a scratch. Suddenly, a click happened in his head. He gently stroked Rhea's back, apologizing for all the nerves he had caused her. Before my eyes, a dangerous moment flashed when the monster broke free from the trap. The idyll was rudely interrupted by an elf who hovered over the couple with a mocking suggestion to postpone their flirting. She amicably extended her hand, genuinely impressed by how the little one had toppled such a monster. Rian and Rhea instantly jumped up, comically and panically justifying themselves in front of the sarcastic woman whom the boy hysterically called Grandma. Grabbing her hand, Rain immediately squinted and sharply reminded her that he had not forgotten how the elf had recently tried to set him up. But just a second later, his face softened, and he warmly thanked the whole team for lending him their strength. The tall elf woman smiled warmly and shook the bewildered young man's hand firmly. The elder elf suddenly grabbed the boy firmly by the shoulders. Without his magical support, they would definitely have lost. The man leaned closer, seriously insisting that they were in an ungodly debt to the savior. The young man flinched, blinking in surprise at such sudden attention. The elf stepped back and, theatrically waving his hand, bowed deeply. He solemnly thanked Rainford on behalf of the forest gods, honestly admitting that otherwise the monster would have devoured them. Lars smiled warmly, recalling how desperately the boy and the sacred beast fought for their forest. All the other elves immediately lined up and bowed so low that the elf girl burst into tears, begging to stop this formality. Rienforth hurriedly waved his hands. For him, all the locals were just neighbors whom he needed to help in trouble. Someone's hand gently ruffled the boy's hair, praising him for his heroism, while he blushed and called himself ordinary. Lars awkwardly sweated, recalling how harsh and hostile their meeting had been at first. The conversation was interrupted by the elf, asking whether the magic had been transferred by some unique spell. The young man was about to answer no, but suddenly froze. A strand on his crown jerked sharply from an unexpected realization. Suddenly, he hesitated. Something did come to his mind. The elf girl assured with a smile that even humans can transmit magic if they have a core for it. She showed a pendant with an empty stone. The boy was surprised, immediately recognizing the magical artifact. However, the stone somehow did not shine at all. A surprised weight hung in the air. The girl proudly explained that this is an ancient treasure of her people, capable of accumulating the power infused into it. But now the stone is black because all the energy has just been transferred from it to the boy. She warned that it would take hundreds of years for the color to return, and the boy carelessly intercepted the ornament. The elf suggested gradually filling it with magic over time. Suddenly, in the hands of the smiling young man, the stone burst into a blinding glow, causing the companions to freeze. The girl burst into tears, as he had just exhausted all his strength, to which the boy naively explained that he had managed to rest for a couple of minutes. The elf girl stared in shock at the artifact. The pendant shone even brighter than before the devastation, and she suddenly grabbed the boy's hands. The stunned elf directly asked if he was some kind of monster or anomaly, to which he merely grumbled offendedly that it was rude. Rian blushed deeply, realizing that he had once again spoken his thoughts aloud. The girl next to her was already begging to modify her body as well, since after such exhaustion no living being could move for a whole day. While she was outraged, Rain clenched his his fist tightly. His magic had almost fully recovered. He turned to Ria and casually asked if he could take the defeated dragon for himself, and I immediately headed towards the giant carcass. The elf girl agreed in confusion, having no idea what he would do with this mountain of meat, while in the background the rescued elder was rejoicing. Rain quietly apologized, and a powerful beam of light burst forth from his outstretched hands. Everyone present was frozen in silent shock. The boy just smiled calmly. A magical impulse passed through the dragon's body, causing the monster to groan softly and twitch. Sparks continued to fall on the scales as Rain confessed that he had planned all of this in the midst of the battle. Suddenly, the giant's mouth opened wide, and with a surge of dark energy, a wild roar echoed. The monster was incredibly satisfied. Rian and Ria froze with completely blank faces, losing the gift of speech, and the beast continued to vibrate contentedly in the black fog, emitting eerie sounds. Absorbing the healing magic, the dragon languished in pleasure, acknowledging it as the most delicious nectar of his life. A prolonged purring escaped from his tusked maw. The fearsome giant sprawled on the ground and purred like a giant kitten in front of the bewildered heroes. Suddenly, the lizard realized the situation and froze sharply. Rian smiled sincerely, rejoicing in the recovery of his former enemy. The dragon immediately simmered with indignation at such a gift, but the young man calmly interrupted him, stating that he had 3 reasons for the healing. Having somewhat quelled his enthusiasm, the giant grimly agreed to listen. Although his pride was still rebelling, living after being defeated by an ordinary person seemed an unbearable disgrace. Rian raised his index finger. He noticed that before his fiery breath, the dragon deliberately shifted the line of attack away from the village. The girls behind were shocked into silence. The monster had no intention of destroying anything from the very beginning. The second reason shocked Canada even more. The lizard didn't even fight seriously. The giant continued to loom silently over the boy, not denying these words. Rian looked straight into the monster's eyes. If it truly craved blood, it would have simply burned the forest from the air or bombarded them with boulders, instantly destroying the entire squad. The boy smiled slyly and urged to just think. He looked at the giant and acknowledged the last attack was clearly not the limit of his strength, no matter how hard it was to accept. The young man challengingly asked if the lizard could strike significantly harder. The answer was obvious. The dragon grimly confirmed. If he fought seriously, there would be no trace left of the entire continent. The elf girl interrupted the conversation and reminded them of the third reason, but the boy immediately asked not to look for a deeper meaning in it. He awkwardly looked away. The girl stubbornly waited for explanations. The giant lizard quietly grunted, listening. The young man calmly replied that he simply did not want anyone's death, and these words shattered the silence with the thunderous laughter of the dragon. Catching his breath, the monster admitted that a long sleep was quite justified if it meant meeting such interesting people afterward. The golden eye narrowed thoughtfully. Has it really been 2,000 years? Hearing this number, the guy immediately asked about the reason for such a long sleep. An old elvish legend surfaced in memory, and the dragon quietly explained it was an elf who had once been his friend that advised him to sleep. Rian hesitantly stammered, asking the dragon looming over them if it still wanted to eat them. The monster merely snorted in surprise, wondering why it should ruin its stomach. The elf indignantly poked him with her finger, reminding him how he had just frightened them with terrifying sacrifices and pacts. The dragon spoke of an ancient agreement. After millennia of sleep, the descendants of the elves were to bring him a powerful mage who would feed him with the magic of light. That's what a friend once told me. His deep voice resonated. The girl blinked, suddenly realizing that the legendary world crisis was just an ordinary shortage of magical energy. The beast looked intently at Reyna, acknowledging that no one before had wielded the magic of light with such power. He stepped forward heavily, correcting her. It was not just a deficiency, but a real global catastrophe. The elf with a stone expression agreed that the world really almost perished from exhaustion back then. Suddenly, the monster abruptly turned to the boy. With a deafening roar, the enormous ancient dragon sprawled on the ground, begging Rain to feed it magic at least occasionally for survival. The boy recoiled in surprise when the fearsome monster pitifully asked to be treated like a poor little lamb. The beast submissively pressed its muzzle into the ground, continuing to whine for help. The elf girl simply shrieked in shock. The legendary ancient dragon was crawling before them on its belly. The elf girl nearly fainted from panic when Rain easily agreed to the conditions of the giant lizard. The boy sincerely assured that he was ready to share his magic at any time. Inspired by this, the new ally firmly stated that he too must prepare properly. The air was split by a powerful rumble. Flying over the cliff, the dragon reported another unfinished business. With a deafening roar, he reminded the forest monsters who the real master was and loudly bid farewell to Rain. The winged silhouette faded in the sky, and the elf girl anxiously inquired whether this agreement had been too reckless. Rain simply waved it off. He thought he would just occasionally visit the dragon in the village and pass on a bit of magic to him. At that time, he was absolutely sure of it. Only later did the boy realize the true weight of that promise. Rain froze, staring at the thick, dark aura that ominously pulsed before him. The sinister shadow emitted dull, eerie sounds. The boy was instantly drenched in cold sweat. The whole horror radiated from the dinner. The special elvish salad and the meat stew on the plates resembled a life-threatening pixel mush. The little familiar stared in shock at the food, but the elf Rhea was simply amazed. Do people really not know such simple home cooking? She smiled joyfully in anticipation of the tasting, asking why Rain was not eating. The boy was desperately looking for a way out. To eat this and not die, he urgently needed Shiro's bottomless stomach. But the trap had already closed. Rhea happily wagged her ears at the table, while Rain looked at the food with a sense of doom, realizing that he was in deep trouble. He glanced into the corner of the room with the last hope. The boy's face twisted in realization of the ruthless betrayal. What a petty coward. Shiro pressed his nose tightly against the wall and trembled slightly, showing with his whole appearance that he was as if he were not there at all. The outrage was growing. That little cowardly creature had become completely brazen, and Shiro himself, hiding, pretended as if he wasn't here at all. Rhea pressed her hands to her chest in indignation. Could he really refuse her food? Rain broke out in a cold sweat and tried to excuse himself with sudden nausea. Her sad gaze left no chance of escape. The boy smiled nervously. Suddenly, two other elf girls ran up to them with cheerful shouts. Realizing there was nowhere to go, Rain closed his eyes and resignedly commanded to begin the meal, startling the birds above the forest. In the next moment, he was already lying on the table without signs of life. The friends realized with horror. The boy dared to taste Rhea's dish, from which even dragons flee. While the half-alive Rain was amazed by their panic, the elf maidens rushed to brew tea to save his taste buds. The hot cup was placed on the table. After the first sip, Rain broke into a grateful smile, and Rhea suddenly asked if he was leaving the village tomorrow. He exhaled with relief, feeling life returning to him. Rhea sadly lowered her gaze. Rian admitted that he would like to leave today so as not to worry his mother, but he overslept for too long. Then the girl intertwined her fingers and looked as serious as possible. Before leaving, she had a request for him as the leader of the elves. Rian calmly took a sip when he was called. He placed a document with a new request in front of the elf Lulu. She listened carefully to the proposal. In an instant, a surprised exclamation rang out. Before them stood a simple wooden hut. Next to it stood a high, deaf stone wall. Rian rushed headlong to the door, followed by a huge, fluffy dog running joyfully. The boy cautiously and fearfully peeked around the corner. In the darkness, a chilling smile flashed. He was caught fleeing from home. A sinister shadow loomed over him, gently whispering his name. Rain was petrified with horror. It was his mother, and he had not sensed her approach at all. The verdict was immediate. The woman ordered him to present his butt for punishment, to which the boy responded with a desperate scream. She dramatically covered her face with her hand, openly mocking his belated remorse. The mother threw her son over her knee and began to harshly spank him, lecturing about night monsters, while Rain begged for mercy through tears. The carriage was already racing away, and the beaten boy was desperately racking his brain on how to get out of this situation in the future. Rian tensed up, panicking as he realized that he was about to get his ass kicked hard. Suddenly, a rumble and a cheerful call sounded outside, announcing that someone was finally home. A carriage drove up to the courtyard. Flash of hope. The boy's eyes widened. He had found his salvation. He sprang from his place and rushed like a bullet towards the carriage, overtaking his mother. With a leap, Ryan jumped onto his father, gripping his coat with a dead hold. The mother stopped, genuinely touched by such a warm scene of reunion. The father laughed loudly from the strong hugs, while Rain desperately nodded along, just to to avoid getting down from his arms. The younger sister of Ellie peeked out from behind the wall timidly, but the father immediately ruined his plan, reminding him that after the mother's punishment, he would also face a serious conversation with his sister. The mother approached closer and calmly asked the man to hand over her runaway son to her. She silently rolled up her sleeves. Understanding the situation, the father closed his eyes and surrendered the boy without a fight. The boy ran away, throwing his burden over his shoulder, and as he ran, he begged for time to explain everything. "I defended my ass," echoed his desperate cry from afar. While the blonde was mentally celebrating her victory, the others tried to calm her down and listen to the fugitive. Later, the company gathered for tea, and the guests instantly appreciated the incredible taste of the drink. Even the reserved butler was astonished and asked where the boy had gotten such luxurious tea leaves. The girl joyfully praised her brother, while he just squinted with self-satisfaction. The young man calmly stated that the tea was gathered in the elven settlement, causing the older guest to choke in shock. He proudly pointed to the glass jar filled with forest treasures, and he promised to later tell in detail how he established contact with the tribe. The blonde girl shouted that the elves had long ago cut themselves off from humans, but the boy merely agreed calmly. But the surprises were not over. He dramatically unfolded an unknown shiny fabric before them. The girls froze, enchanted by the beauty of the material. The young man proudly named his find silk. For the elves, it was ordinary clothing, but the young man knew very well that in other countries, a fortune would be spent on this fabric. The elf explained that this luxurious fabric is woven from the threads of a giant butterfly. Placing the bundle on the table, she voiced the main point. Her people are ready for friendship and trade with others. The attendees immediately understood that the guests needed two things from this agreement. A logical question arose about what exactly the elves want in return. The conditions turned out to be surprisingly simple: strong iron tools and peace. Rain smiled modestly, reminding that he was only the son of a lord and had no right to form alliances. During the family dinner, the boy recounted everything to his family and was about to leave the final decision to his father when suddenly he flinched. His eyes widened in shock. The stern lord broke into a wide smile and joyfully praised his son with all his heart. Rain was openly stunned. The father was excitedly gripping his shoulders, shouting about the historical significance of the deal, while the boy nervously tried to calm him down. It was not difficult to understand such a reaction. Elves had hated humans for centuries, and no one even suspected their presence in the local forest. And now these recluses themselves offer peace, first-class silk, and delicious tea. Watching this storm of emotions, Rain realized that his father was simply on cloud nine with happiness. A joyful exclamation rang out that all the efforts were worth it, and the white wolf Shiro grinned contentedly. The father hugged Reina tightly, laughing that even an urgent call to the capital would not ruin his mood. Someone's hand nervously crumpled the fabric of the clothing. The boy and his father turned around. Ellie was standing in front of them. The girl was hiding behind a giant plush bear and looking at them from under her brow. She pouted and muttered that Dad was being unfair. Ellie continued to glare at him discontentedly. Rian blinked in confusion. His father returned so secretly that the boy lost the chance to say everything first. The sister's face instantly softened, and with a warm smile she said, "Welcome home, Brother Rain." Ellie joyfully threw herself around his neck, and here Rain calmly revealed that he had managed to fight with a dragon, recalling the giant clawed paw of the monster. The legs involuntarily froze in place. From behind the trees, Shiro emerged, and the conversation suddenly halted with a brief realization. The boy just remembered something important in time. The elves waved joyfully goodbye, begging Rain to definitely come back to play again. He had just experienced the most terrifying horror of his life, finding himself before the jaws of a giant dragon. The world before my eyes still floated. Rain froze, barely holding back tears. At home, he was surrounded by the warm smiles of his loved ones, but the gentleness instantly turned into a harsh command to bend over, and a desperate scream echoed over the rooftops. The mother sternly reminded that one cannot run away without permission. Another prolonged scream erupted from the house. Having received a reprimand, Rainford straightened up, smiled sincerely, and ceremoniously reported his return. Usually, a happy ending occurs here, but for Rain, it was just the beginning. And although the story would usually have ended there, Rain still had many troubles ahead. In the bustling bustling market, locals eagerly praised the Lord who transformed the wasteland into a flourishing region. The shelves were overflowing with fresh tomatoes and supplies. The delivery finally worked properly. The streets buzzed with the conversations of the crowd and job seekers. New displaced people have flocked to the city. And meanwhile, far beyond the walls, an endless quiet forest spread out. What a grace! The boy splashed joyfully in the lake while Ellie and the cat rested on the shore. He swam relaxedly, although he knew perfectly well that this body of water had never been here. The white, fluffy cat lazily sprawled on the grass. The lake was formed by accident. It was a crater from a powerful explosion when the boy still couldn't control his magic. Now the pit was filled with water, and he carelessly lay on his back, calling Ellie into the water. He was smilingly persuading her to step in at least up to her ankles. The girl mumbled something, but due to the distance, he couldn't make out a single word. The boy asked in confusion as he heard some nonsense. Then Ellie blushed, cupped her hands like a megaphone, and shouted at the top of her lungs that she simply didn't have a swimsuit. He stood frozen in the water, suddenly bumping into someone's dish. In memory, the conversation about the locals who, due to the influx of immigrants, began to dump garbage right in the forest, surfaced instantly. Diving deeper, he saw a submerged cart and scattered boxes at the bottom. Surfacing, the boy sighed sadly. The lake had been so crystal clear. On the shore, Ellie joyfully greeted him while he quickly dried his body with magic. The warm light broke free from his palms, instantly evaporating the moisture. He smiled contentedly while drying his hair. To avoid upsetting his sister with the dirty find, he lied that he simply decided to take a break. He calmly asked the girl what exactly she was shouting to him from afar. Ellie nervously pressed her hands to her chest and admitted that she was very afraid of the local slimes. He thoughtfully lowered his gaze as he did not notice any monsters under the water. The boy asked his sister in confusion. An image of a slippery creature flashed in his mind, and he suddenly froze in shock. Ellie panicked and shouted. The huge slime had already stealthily gotten stuck in her brother's swim trunks. From the bushes, a translucent drop suddenly jumped out at them, causing the boy to flinch in fright. However, a creature gently landed on his head. Ellie was not scared at all and whispered in wonder that the slime was beautiful. Her eyes sparkled with excitement. The boy calmly examined the flickering insides of the beast until his sister reminded their father's words. These creatures can dissolve anything. With a sudden movement, he tore the slime off himself and slammed it to the ground with a flourish, accompanied by the frightened scream of the girl. Ellie rushed to her brother, asking if he was in pain, to which he nervously laughed and admitted that at first he wanted to play with them, but he suddenly fell silent. He continued to awkwardly assure that he was fine, vainly trying to hide the panic tremor. The boy said that a giant white wolf named Shiro saved him from the mistake, and also mentioned a warning from a friend named Ellie. Only now did it occur to him, where does this girl know so well the habits of magical creatures? The wolf quietly snapped his fingers, and the boy exhaled in confusion. Ellie thoughtfully touched her lips, trying to remember if the mysterious friend had mentioned anything about the place where these monsters come from. The brother rubbed his palm, feeling only a slight tingling instead of acid burns, and then the girl gave the main clue. Slimes appear where there is water. This detail changed everything. Now they knew exactly where to go next. The boy clenched his fist sharply and passionately suggested to Ellie to conduct an experiment. She just asked in confusion. Since the diet of slimes was unknown, ordinary forest debris was collected for the test. Dry leaves, twigs, and stones. With childlike excitement, the little ones threw all of this straight at the creature. The wood slowly sank to the bottom, releasing bubbles. The boy decided to throw in a few more branches and wait. Meanwhile, Ellie got bored and sat down by the bushes. She was completely captivated by a random butterfly. In the end, both of them leaned over the slime again. Suddenly, the young man gasped in shock. He joyfully jumped up, showing his friend how solid objects gradually dissolve in the slime. The girl quickly got tired and fell asleep, and he gently draped a blanket over her. Sitting next to a giant fluffy dog, the boy began to ponder how to properly present the idea to his strict father so that he would allow them to breed slimes for the benefit of their lands. He was contemplating how to present the idea of breeding slugs to his father in a favorable way. Everything depended on the right presentation. He nervously sat down on the grass, realizing that everything now depended on the right serve. The gaze fell on the slime near the sleeping wolf. Can these these creatures be made to work for the benefit of their lands? The boy strained his brain, trying to connect the ability of slime to dissolve anything with the urgent problems of the area. He whispered to wake Shiro, instructing him to quietly head home so as not to disturb Ellie. The plan has matured. It's time to go to father immediately. The long humming from intense thoughts was abruptly cut off by a sudden revelation. In the office, the father and his assistant carefully listened to his environmental cleanup project. An open box with a slimy creature inside lay on the table. You were right. Due to the lack of landfills, waste has already started to be dumped directly into the forest lake. Father thoughtfully rubbed his chin. The idea of solving the waste crisis through the unique appetite of slime truly made sense. But the Lord categorically refused to put the townspeople in danger, especially since his assistant was seeing such a strange type of monster for the first time. The father grimly recalled how in his youth he used to exterminate these creatures in droves, as they do not forgive a loss of vigilance. The boy stared in shock at the Lord. It turned out that the bloodthirsty monsters from his stories bore no resemblance to this sweet pet at all. Rain carefully dipped his hand into the box. The substance felt like a uniquely soluble slime liquid. A sudden loud shout made the boy jump in fright. The man thoughtfully rubbed a drop of mucus between his fingers. He confirmed the nature of the find, but pointed out the impossible. The creature's body was missing the magical stone. This contradicted common sense. After all, any monster or magical beast in this world simply must have such a core. A tense silence hung in the air. Rain frowned, suspecting the appearance of an unknown subspecies, when suddenly there was a knock at the door. A timid voice from the corridor asked to come in. The host of the office postponed his affairs, sent the maid for tea, and allowed the guests to enter. The little girl squealed with excitement, immediately recognizing the slime secretion in the box. Her companion gently apologized for the intrusion. Little Ellie simply couldn't wait to meet her older brother. The little sister rushed at Ryan with enthusiasm, joyfully babbling about the slimy find. The boy could only helplessly come to terms with these sudden strong hugs. Rian leaned towards Ellie, asking about the mysterious Slime-chan's droppings. The girl just looked at him in confusion. She silently blinked, squeezing a tiny slime creature in her hands. At that moment, Reina was struck by a sudden realization, as if by an electric shock. He carefully examined the lump of slime. It was just a discarded fragment, not the monster itself. The boy quickly turned to his father and stated that his sister was right. He explained that the true enormous body of the monster is hidden at the bottom of the lake where he swam before. Understanding the threat to the townspeople, Rain demanded to set out for reconnaissance immediately. The man rubbed his chin tensely, realizing the true scale of the problem. He raised his head in astonishment. The boy leaned forward eagerly, burning with impatience and pleading to be let go. Suddenly, the calm voice of my mother interrupted the conversation. Rian mentally groaned, recalling his boring lessons on etiquette and dance. He wanted much more to chase slugs in his second life. The woman smiled gently and said that she had a proposal. The boy looked up in surprise and quietly called for his mother. Miriam calmly asked the men if they were worried about letting Rain go alone and if they wanted to provide him with protection. Rain was touched and frozen, completely not expecting such maternal care. But the woman just laughed carefreely. She was not worried about her son at all. She was more frightened that the little one would start throwing magic around recklessly and cause trouble. She explained that sending unprepared people is dangerous, and waiting for mercenary adventurers takes too long. The interlocutor thoughtfully lowered his eyes. He hinted that the ideal candidate for the escort is already in this room. The man assumed it was the experienced Fried, but Miriam sharply disagreed. Fried only turned around in surprise upon hearing his name. A wide, self-assured smile played on the woman's lips. She proudly placed her hand on her chest and declared that she would personally go on the journey with her son. A loud gasp of surprise nearly blew the roof off the mansion. Everyone present was simply frozen in shock. A dense forest stretched all the way to the horizon. Rian and his mother raced through the thickets on the back of a giant white wolf, which the woman enthusiastically praised for its speed. Shiro-chan confidently carried its riders forward. The mother chirped joyfully that she felt like the wind, to which the boy only skeptically asked again. Rain knew the truth perfectly well. In reality, the wolf was running much slower because the mother weighed more than him and Ellie. To avoid saying anything unnecessary about the weight, the guy hurriedly agreed with her words about the incredible caution possession of the beast. The woman smiled happily, while Rain nervously wiped away the cold sweat. He planned to explore the forest slugs alone, ignoring the warnings of his father and the servants. The boy could not even imagine that his mother would actually follow him. Her quiet, sly laugh abruptly pulled him out of his thoughts. The woman slyly remarked that all her son's thoughts were literally written on his face, thoughtfully touching her hair. The mother confessed that she had read about the slime that Rain found in a book during her student years. The boy was frankly surprised. She usually wasn't interested in monsters and avoided such outings. Suddenly, mysterious words from Frida about her past at the academy surfaced in his memory. She recalled how her mother mastered water magic brilliantly at an elite capital school. The girl herself studied magical creatures and once uncovered something interesting in the library. I stumbled upon an old book about the mysterious slugs of Aurora. The boy was asking about the find while they raced through the forest on a giant white dog. The girl sighed dreamily. The legend promised happiness to those who meet the angry slime. These creatures were found only near the purest springs with a powerful magical aura. The boy found it cheap mysticism, so he demanded real facts. The dark crowns of the trees rushed past them. She mentioned the drawing. These monsters are much more dangerous than ordinary ones and have a specific scream. The boy summarized, when suddenly she revealed another detail: digestion. Her gaze suddenly became heavier. She was babbling something about their sweet voice when water suddenly shimmered ahead. The girl exclaimed excitedly. They had finally arrived at the destination. Before them lay a magnificent transparent lake, enveloped in fresh air and the singing of birds. A powerful burst of magic illuminated the clearing. The mother felt the energy with excitement, while Rain dryly reminded her that she had created it herself. Suddenly, their attention was drawn to a gigantic translucent silhouette. The boy suddenly turned around at the voice. In front of them, a giant mass bubbled loudly, in which the woman immediately recognized her recent find. Rian tensed up, finally convinced that it was a genuine Aurora slime. The shimmering mountain of slime emitted a strange squeak, but its colossal size made the boy scream in terror. He was simply stunned by the size of the creature. Instead, the mother simply folded her hands calmly. "Mom, aren't you scared at all?" Rain asked nervously. The woman dreamily wished for her son to grow up just as big, which ultimately threw him off track. The slime wobbled heavily, swelling from the excessive amount of swallowed food. Suddenly, the slimy mass effortlessly pulled the discarded old wardrobe towards itself. Silence. The furniture instantly, and without a trace, dissolved in the slime. The boy's fear suddenly changed to childlike delight. Rain clenched his fists triumphantly and shouted with excitement. In his eyes, understanding sparked. With such a processing speed, they would finally solve the waste problem in their lands. The idea of using slugs for waste disposal turned out to be brilliant. He apologized to the giant wolf Shiro, promising to play later, and set off, pondering how to transport the monster. The issue of logistics troubled him. Suddenly, the wolf tensed and growled hoarsely towards the forest. While the boy froze, a strange noise was heard among the trees. The rustling grew louder. They stared intently at the tall grass, where something invisible was swiftly making its way towards them. It was already very close. The boy nearly jumped in fright when his mother suddenly and completely calmly revealed that she had just remembered one important detail. She casually touched her cheek while her son looked at her in complete shock. The woman sighed sweetly, and this carefree tone made him break out in a cold sweat. She finally recalled a passage from the book. Glowing aurora slimes are solid clumps of magical energy that act on predators as an irresistible lure. A giant cloud of killer bees had already descended from the sky upon them, but the mother simply smiled happily. She was genuinely pleased that everything was aligning so perfectly with the textbook. In the darkness, the first words of the magical incantation echoed sharply. Shiro lunged forward, shielding his mother with his body, and desperately shouted at her to duck while she continued to smile carefreely. The woman calmly began to chant the spell, calling for fire to become a punishing net for her enemies. Giant insects with a deafening buzz charged into attack. The boy tensed up, ready to take any hit for the sake of his mother. One smooth sweep of the staff, and a devastating fire trap descended upon the swarm of monsters. Shiro was amazed by the incredible speed of the magic, while his mother merely smiled gently and asked if he wanted to see her cool side just once. She smoothly lowered the weapon. A warm, completely non-combative innovative smile played on her face. The burning monsters shrieked as they fell apart into pieces. The earth shook from the impact. The mist dispersed, revealing the proud and unyielding figure of the mage. The woman raised her staff to the sky, and the space shone with magical energy at the words of a new spell about the primal flame. True hell broke loose, sweeping everything in its path with a colossal torrent of fire. Shiro barely managed to cover his face from the scorching heat, shockingly realizing that such destructive power simply cannot be wielded with such a sweet smile. The girl smiled predatorily, and Rain mentally agreed. It was better never to anger such an ally. Her aura promised only pain to her enemies. The boy and his fluffy wolf froze in place. In an instant, a devastating blow tore the opponent into a bloody mess. The threat seemed to have passed, but suddenly the girl's face was distorted by horror. Rian had not seen this, and was already relaxedly calling the wolf to gather magical stones. The flash behind him made him turn sharply. A giant armored insect swooped down from the air, crashing into the boy with all its weight. One monster managed to survive, and it significantly surpassed the others in size. The creature clung on with a dead grip, while Rain tried to tear it off through clenched teeth. "Rian," the girl shouted. The boy barely held up against the blow and already realized that he was facing a special mutant. The shell of the monster cracked dully from the strong compression. The armor cracked under the pressure, and the monster let out a muffled groan. The girl desperately shouted to take cover while Rain was trying with all his strength to tear the giant bee off himself. Suddenly, the space around him burst into blinding light. A powerful impulse threw the boy and the monster far back. Thanks to the slime, he finally got away from the bee. A single chance for salvation appeared. Finding himself in a strange liquid, Rain sharply kicked the insect away with his foot, and right there he froze. The creature's body began to rapidly disintegrate. The boy stared in shock at how quickly the unknown substance was eating away at the enemy. He was engulfed by panic. His hand was already numb, and soon he would painfully dissolve just like that bee. But in a moment he blinked in surprise. For some reason, the expected pain was absent. Instead of the inevitable death, Rain saw a gigantic shining crystal before him. His leg floated smoothly in weightlessness. The shoes remained completely intact. A lonely bubble floated slowly upwards. Only a deep, shimmering silence prevailed around. Heavy drops fell down and thudded against the dark surface. The boy hung underwater next to a massive crystal, wondering why it hadn't dissolved yet, when suddenly he heard a concerned female voice in his head. This surprise threw him off balance. In the darkness, a solitary bubble of air rose. She silently floated upwards. The young man approached the magical stone, realizing that the voice was coming from there. Crystal asked if he could be heard, and the boy instinctively covered his mouth with his hand. A silent sigh escaped from the lips. He quickly composed himself, guessing that he could respond mentally. He barely smiled and directly asked if he was in front of Slytherin of Aurora. The crystal softly glowed and confirmed this name. A logical question arose in the young man's mind. He pointed at himself in confusion and wondered why the monster hadn't devoured him. The gaze froze in anticipation. The crystal gleamed brightly with indignation, and the voice emotionally exclaimed that it would never be eaten. The boy lit up, calling the unknown interlocutor his savior. Instead, the voice from the flying crystal remarked in confusion that they were actually meeting for the first time, which completely bewildered the young man. Crystal calmly confirmed that until this day they had truly never crossed paths. But suddenly he was stunned by the statement. The young man saved his life. A memory of a quiet forest lake surfaced before my eyes. The boy furrowed his brows, completely not understanding what this conversation was about. Then the crystal confessed that he is Aurora Slime, an extremely rare mutant that everyone is hunting. From terrifying insects to other slugs, everyone was ready to tear him to shreds. Because of this, every day of his was permeated with a sticky fear. Since birth, he hid under the roots of trees, trembling at any rustle. To avoid revealing myself, I had to survive by licking only the morning dew. The young man was surprised to think that monsters also feel fear, to which the crystal instantly cut in, saying it hears every thought of his. The slug moved on to the main point. That day he was once again cautiously crawling through the thickets when he was suddenly attacked. He was mutilated and brutally burned, so the maimed creature could only lie there and wait for the inevitable death. But suddenly the story was interrupted. A voice from above declared that it was the young man who put an end to to those times, causing him to blink in confusion. The memory instantly conjured an image of a colossal explosion that literally tore apart space. In place of the forest, there was a giant smoky crater and the solitary shadow of a boy. Then he slowly turned around with a calm, innocent look. Remembering his crime, the hero instantly panicked. Slice recounted how he once crawled to a fresh crater and saw a very young mage there. The little monster glanced at the crystal, and suddenly a thought struck him. The voice from the shining stone excitedly recalled how the boy with a gentle smile unleashed incredibly pure magic. Streams of water continuously filled the scorched pit. Then the little one, in wild panic, created a lake to quickly cover the traces of the destroyed forest. Sly immediately saw through the deception, while the hero merely awkwardly scratched his head. His motives were far from heroism. The crystal flared up and cut off. The reason doesn't matter, as the young man saved his life. Their connection remained an anomaly, as even rare spirits could not speak to humans in words. The great crystal shimmered in the thickness of the water, emitting a mysterious pulsation. The boy floated nearby, having heard a quiet giggle from there. The voice explained. His magical stone had lain too long in the lake, soaked with the young man's mana. Crystal unexpectedly approached him with a request for a favor. The boy's eyelids suddenly began to feel heavy from unbearable drowsiness. However, he was only mentally pleased that they could finally communicate freely. Crystal easily read his thoughts. The voice confessed that it could not leave this place, and the separated fragments of the body no longer belonged to it. The essence allowed him to freely collect its shards, capable of dissolving anything, and the boy joyfully thanked. Crystal promised to never harm people, as the lake provided him with limitless magic. The boy triumphantly raised his fist in the air. This forever solved the city's waste problem. He sincerely thanked once again for the generosity, but the essence stopped him with its last request. The voice asked the boy to name his name in order to engrave it on stone forever. He modestly replied that his name was not worth mentioning. The fingers gently touched the light. Reincarnated hung in space before the huge crystal, revealing his name to it for the first time. Warmed by this heat, he smiled sincerely and promised to definitely return. Someone's eye barely opened at the quiet whisper about the future. Blinding flash. The rain slowly receded into the depths, joyfully bidding farewell to the new acquaintance. Silence and deep sleep. The boy blinked in confusion already in his own bed. In a second, two girls rushed at him with a scream, and right after that, a giant fluffy dog just plopped down on them. A heavy paw mercilessly crushed the girl's face. Someone shouted angrily at the beast. Rain merely sighed resignedly, utterly crushed in someone's powerful muscular embrace. He was squeezed in an embrace so tightly that the poor thing could barely breathe. Deafening roar. The father burst into the room and shouted frantically upon seeing his son conscious. But first, a huge white wolf joyfully knocked the boy down, almost crushing him with its mass. Cain barely managed to utter a morning greeting. In the next moment, the father scooped him up in a wild embrace, barely calculating his strength so as not to break his son's bones. The man suddenly recoiled and tensed his muscles so that the shirt on his chest creaked. The boy blinked in confusion at the timid reminder of weakness after the illness. The father joyfully waved it off, while Cain could only silently marvel at the wild energy of his parents. The man continued to laugh happily, confident that his son's recent magical outburst was the main proof of his recovery. Eventually, peace finally reigned over the family estate. When the commotion subsided, the boy learned that he had been lying in bed for a whole 2 days. It turned out that a wolf named Shiro saved him in the forest at that time. The beast quickly pulled him out after being engulfed by the deadly bee and slime. Cain tried to tell his family about his conversation with the Aurora slime, but this attempt ended in nothing. The boy awkwardly tried to dismiss what he had experienced as just a regular dream, but the girl across from him smiled and reminded him that he had been truly saved. Meanwhile, the adults were already discussing the next steps. They decided to involve the townspeople in collecting the remnants of the magical slime. Suddenly, their conversation about the unexpected properties of monsters was interrupted by a ringing child's voice. The little sister ran up to the bed, excitedly showing her brother his own shirt. The fabric shone with new colors, and the men immediately realized that the liquid of Aurora's slime would become a unique dye and a new profitable product for their lands. While the young man obediently stayed in bed at the command of his relatives, one of the assistants parents quickly rushed home to check the new samples. The old saying that Aurora slime brings happiness has suddenly turned out to be pure truth. But for the boy himself, this quiet moment was a true treasure. A giant wolf is panting nearby, his sister is dozing on the blanket, and his friend is calmly peeling an apple for him. The idyll was interrupted by a dull, prolonged roar. The ground trembled under the massive steps of the giant scaled beasts that were inexorably advancing forward. From the high hill, a carefree view of the peaceful coastal town opened up. Two burly strangers on horned monsters stopped at the edge of a cliff, coldly surveying the territory of the Proud Road family. Two riders on scaly beasts stood still before the boundless lake. The dragon's paw heavily stepped on the grass. The mustached warrior admitted that until the last moment he considered the rumors about this giant body of water to be a fabrication. His companion silently gazed at the water's surface. They had come here specifically for an inspection. He dipped his fingers into the cool current, trying to understand what trick the Proud Road family had pulled. Meanwhile, somewhere in the field, someone called out to Mr. Rain. The boy in the straw hat turned around in surprise, clutching a basket of fresh tomatoes. The subordinates ran closer and began to beg him to leave this rough work to them. But the young man was not going to retreat. He was convinced that this farming routine was the direct path to his dream of a slow life. No political trouble. The boy squinted contentedly at these thoughts. Rian casually noted that thanks to the new dam, the harvests would rapidly increase, and asked the servants what had happened. The assistant remained puzzled in silence, while the young man with a serious expression declared that rulers are simply obliged to personally understand the hard work of their citizens. The villagers informed Reina that a carriage had been sent for him. In a moment, the luxurious carriage was already rumbling down the path. Inside, the boy asked the attendant if something had happened at the estate since transport had been sent for him. The one-eyed servant stumbled. He hesitantly stretched out that, "You see, there is one thing." "Do we have guests?" Rain immediately guessed. Thick forests and cliffs flowed by motionless outside the window. The man nodded. "The master demands the personal presence of the young gentleman." A nomadic tribe of Buryats from the invincible east visited them, to which Rain only asked in surprise who they actually were. The servant was taken aback. Could it be that the boy really doesn't know this fearsome name? The young gentleman playfully stuck out his tongue. "No, not a clue." Then the man seriously explained that these people do not tolerate any instructions and speak with their kingdom only as equals. They roam the vast steppes far to the east of the Proud Road territories, and their elite cavalry goes into battle mounted on powerful armored earth dragons. It was rumored that the military strength of this tribe is equivalent to that of an entire state's army. The boy wondered aloud how they managed to maintain their independence next to such an aggressive empire. The secret lay in their invincible body of earth dragons, and now the carriage of these warriors was just approaching the estate. Two huge scaly faces unexpectedly emerged from behind the glass. The boy, along with the servant, leaned against the window, mesmerized by the sight of the monsters. The door handle clicked. Rainsford entered the hall. A sturdy mustached man approached and introduced himself as Basil Buryat, the chief of the Eastern Steppe tribe. The boy joyfully ran out to his father, instantly attracting the attention of the guests. The chief politely apologized for the sudden visit. Next, his son Sergei was named. While the little one wondered to himself, the older guest turned out to be even more muscular than his own father. Basil remained silent, drilling the hosts with his gaze. Renford sincerely thanked them for the long journey and welcomed them to his home. The young man looked small against the backdrop of his giant father, appearing quite thin. Suddenly he noticed that the always calm Rainsford had tensed up like a string. The long-haired master settled comfortably on the sofa and inquired what had brought the closed Buryat tribe to them. The sudden visit of strangers, with whom they had never dealt, caused logical tension. The young guest was embarrassed, fully understanding that they could be suspected of scouting the territory before the attack. The mustached leader of the nomads decided to do without preliminaries. He looked hard at the hosts and directly asked to save his people. The interlocutor froze in confusion, while the little boy next to him stared in surprise. The lord spread his hands. Their rural province is too poor to help an entire tribe. The chief sadly recalled how his people had traveled for generations with the seasons and grazed their livestock. The young man took the initiative and explained that their entire life revolved around 3 large steppe lakes. Suddenly, all these bodies of water completely dried dried up for no reason. The master asked distrustfully if everything really happened so suddenly. The guest began to list other local wonders, from the unexpected production of iron to the giant lake on the plateau, while the small one near the lord nervously dripped with sweat, realizing that the culprit of all this chaos was now sitting in the very same room. The nomads came here precisely because of the incredible rumors. The dead wastelands in the east had somehow transformed into a blooming paradise. Swallowing his pride, the chief asked the Buryat tribe to help with the knowledge that brought the endless wastelands to life. The boy cautiously glanced at his older companion. They sat silently on the luxurious sofa opposite the two men, and a tense silence hung in the room. The mustached leader bowed his head low in front, respectfully accepting all the terms. Suddenly, the little one lightly coughed into his fist and asked for permission to speak frankly. The child's gaze instantly became serious. He coldly stated that they demanded compensation for their help, which openly shocked those present. The air was sliced by a sharp movement. A hot-headed subordinate of the leader jumped to his feet and shouted, enraged by the audacity of the little one. His palm slammed into the table. The long-haired man calmly covered the boy with his hand and acknowledged that his son had gone too far, but he did not back down. The mustached leader harshly grabbed his subordinate by the arm and ordered Serge to keep himself in check and not to disgrace himself. The boy's father tried to smooth things over, explaining that the little one just wanted to settle all business matters at once without any hidden motives. The reminder that free help in politics is much more frightening than a demand for payment left Serge speechless. The long-haired man just added that his son sometimes thinks too maturely, so such a shock is quite expected. Sergei looked up in confusion, finally starting to understand the rules of this game. Renford confidently stated that it was his magical power that became the foundation for the development of the Eastern Desert. He looked like a typical caring dad, although the little one only squinted suspiciously in response. The conversation was interrupted by the voice of the tribe leader, who suddenly addressed Sergio. At the mere mention of magic, the warrior shuddered in shock. The tension in the room was palpable. Realizing his mistake, the man quickly apologized for his unrestrained reaction. He explained that the Buryats are a people of warriors, and they have no idea about witchcraft. The boy felt the heavy gaze of the young warrior on him and wondered to himself if he had dirtied his face with something. The head of the tribe got down to business and offered a generous payment: 20 heads of cattle, horses, and supplies of food. Sergi raised his hand, stopping him. Their home needed only one specific thing. He categorically refused to take the livestock, explaining that taking the animals during the drought would be too painful for the tribe. The leader noticeably became nervous, as they had almost nothing else to offer in return. Instead of gold, the boy chose a much more valuable reward: eternal friendship and honest trade between their families for future generations. It was about an equal exchange and warm relationships that were to be strengthened from generation to generation. The last word hung in the air. A heavy silence fell in the room. Then the first sound was heard. Someone snorted briefly. The boy confidently explained that stable trading would bring significantly more benefits than rapid resource depletion, although in reality he simply wanted to see Ellie in a cute fluffy sweater to the point of madness. The guest was stunned by such iron logic. The boy mentally acknowledged that he was half driven by pure selfishness. The mustached man across couldn't hold back and burst into tears of genuine delight. He officially agreed to all the terms and ordered to settle the matter immediately. Grayford contentedly placed his hand on his son's head. The guest suddenly jumped up and exclaimed to the whole hall that Grayford had raised an absolutely incredible son. He hurriedly left the estate to tell his people about this deal as soon as possible. He ordered his companion Sergio to immediately head back to inform the tribesmen about the agreement. The man triumphantly exclaimed that from now on, the lands of Prodrod are under reliable protection. The guests on the scaly beasts turned around and rushed away, promising to meet again. Everything ended as quickly as it began, like a real storm. The boy stood still, thoughtfully gazing into the void. When the satellite suggested returning as well, he simply agreed briefly. The figures of the horsemen quickly faded on the horizon under his watchful gaze. A cold sweat broke out on the boy from the anticipation that this visit was just the beginning of new major problems. He looked back at them for the last time. Calm waters and mountain peaks greeted the heroes at the threshold of new adventures. Ahead lay a wide and uncharted land. Rainford held tightly to Shiro's white fur, genuinely admiring the strength of his wolf. Before them lay the endless expanses of the Great Eastern Steppe. The boy happily squinted in the sun, recalling the recent visit of the Buryat tribe to their lands. He sent the main convoy ahead and decided to catch up with them on horseback to travel lightly. Rainford lay on the grass and gazed at the high sky, trying to gather his thoughts before preparing for the task. Shiro happily licked his owner right in the face, as he clearly enjoyed the wild race. At first, they planned to travel much longer, but the wolf's excitement changed all the timelines. Thanks to Shiro's energy, the journey to the settlement took only 3 days. Lord Basil ran out to meet him and expressed his gratitude for Rainford's swift arrival. The host led the guest to the settlement, noting that the carts with supplies had just arrived at the location. Rainford gratefully bowed for such a warm and sincere reception. Seeing the crowd of people, he realized that everyone had truly been waiting for his arrival. Ray instantly recognized the giant as the same Shiro from the estate and was genuinely alarmed that he might have seen his recent antics. The team had already unloaded the heavy cart filled with wooden boxes. The boy showed the mustache a mountain of provisions, explaining that his father sent it due to the water shortage. The man was stunned by the unexpected sweetness and couldn't believe he was holding a vegetable, not a fruit. Rian decisively reached for the next fruit. He said that these tomatoes are the pride of his native land and advised to taste them just like that, without any processing. Glancing over the poor pastures, the young man understood why the locals were accustomed only to milk and roots. Noticing a group of peasants, he warmly called the children over to him. The little boy stopped as if rooted to the spot, curiously examining the stranger. Rian patiently waited by the cart while people hesitated to come closer. He introduced himself amicably and offered the little one a juicy treat. The boy carefully took the fruit and finally took his first bite. His face instantly broke into a smile. It was incredibly delicious. He clung tightly to the red tomato as if it were the most precious treasure. Rian smiled warmly at the leader and asked him to set aside all formalities and just call him by his name. Suddenly, Sergi interrupted the conversation, grimly asking for permission to speak as well. He stepped forward, silently looming over the boy. Rian looked around in surprise at Lord Sergi, not understanding the reason for such tension. He immediately went to the complaints, asking why the guy had left them without the most essential thing, water. While the leader bowed low and thanked for the food that was supposed to save the people from hunger, the situation was becoming increasingly acute. Sergio continued to stand his ground, looking at the teenager with obvious irritation. Even full boxes of vegetables could not calm him, as without water any food seemed worthless to him. He burst into a scream, angrily asking if they had not heard his words last time. The man rehearsed that Rhine did not understand the suffering of their people at all, until the leader grabbed him by the shoulder, demanding that he immediately be quiet. Sergi tried to break free, but the leader's heavy hand forced him to stop. Rian paused and calmly addressed the angry lord. While the opponent was boiling with rage, the boy simply smiled confidently and said that he just saw no point in carrying water with him. He stunned everyone with the statement, "He is capable of creating as much water as they will need by himself." The man was stunned, stumbling from complete bewilderment. Sergi told Rain directly that the strength of one water mage would never be enough for the entire settlement. The boy suddenly interrupted him, pointing at the empty vats. Sergei only briefly confirmed his guess. He sighed heavily, deciding that this task was not for a child, and suggested asking Lord Clayford for help again. While he lamented that there were no supplies, the air around suddenly trembled with moisture. The people below shouted in surprise, and Rain realized that behind Sergio's mask of roughness lay a genuine concern for his tribe. Sergi felt something strange behind him and turned around sharply. Rain smiled calmly while large drops of water gathered around him in defiance of all laws. "What the hell is this? Is it magic?" exclaimed the man, not believing his own eyes. The boy was completely focused, imagining a stream capable of saving this village. He saw how the heavenly water passed through the thickness of the mountain rocks, becoming as clear as crystal. Fresh, sparkling stream. A colossal water sphere hung over the crowd, and Serhi completely lost his ability to speak. The boy was creating the impossible without uttering a single word of the spell. The boy focused and unleashed his power, commanding the magic to fill the jugs to the brim. The water surged upward with a powerful jerk. A blinding flash momentarily obscured everything around. The stream roared and foamed, obeying his will. The element excitement definitely hit the dish. He wiped the sweat from his face and smiled contentedly, looking at the result of his work. When the boy turned around, he saw only a stunned crowd frozen in silent silence. Everything inside has gone cold. He panically thought, could it be that his thoughts had just burst out loud and everyone around heard this emotional explosion? One of the girls carefully scooped water from the filled cup. She stood as if rooted to the spot, while the villagers behind her could only exhale in shock. The girl blushed deeply as she gazed into the water. The guy suddenly realized this tribe doesn't know magic at all, and he just went too far. But the girl finally recovered from the shock and joyfully announced to everyone that the water was simply wonderful. The girl greedily gulped down the water and cried out in delight, for she had never tasted anything more delicious in her life. The men nearby only exchanged surprised glances, asking her not to be so reckless. The crowd sprang to its feet and rushed towards the huge jugs with a single shout, "Water!" People were stunned in front of the completely filled vessels, unable to utter a word from shock. Rain smiled gently, genuinely happy that he had finally managed to make everyone happy. The woman carefully fed the weakened old man, persuading him to drink as much as he wanted. Looking at the clean splashes in the air, the boy promised himself to do even more for these people. The chief of the Buryat tribe could not hold back his tears, realizing that his people had finally been saved. His words of gratitude for saving the tribe sounded like the highest reward for Rein. Suddenly, a blinding pillar of light pierced the clouds, striking directly into the ground where the young man stood. The first heavy drops fell on the scorched earth, and the chief whispered the name of his savior with hope. The sky finally opened up with a gracious downpour, and the happy tribe, in a single impulse, rushed to celebrate the miracle. Someone softly called Rain through the veil of rain. Rain stood under the downpour, while below, the tribe joyfully celebrated the long-awaited rain. The rain was pouring down on the ground, and the boy just stood under the downpour, holding his palm out to the cold stream. The girl next to her was beside herself with excitement. She was shouting that he was incredible because he managed to conquer the water and change the weather so easily. He simply lifted a mass of water into the air, and with the help of the wind, dispersed it, creating a real rain. The boy just awkwardly smiled, assuring that he had merely cast a water spell into the sky. She playfully tousled his hair while he tried to prove that he hadn't done anything noteworthy. While the girl was fascinated by his cool magic, the older brother was stunned, refusing to believe his own eyes. She kept laughing, admitting that she understood absolutely nothing, while the guy just nodded in confusion. The brother stood still, repeating to himself that such magic simply could not exist. The boy noticed the strange state of the older man and quietly called out to him, but he just stood there with a stone face. He was shaken with rage and confusion. The warrior had always considered mages to be pathetic weaklings who couldn't even save them from thirst in the past. He remembered his father and sister and was horrified. The little one had created this storm without any spell or prayer. In the head of the elder, everything got mixed up, and he began to doubt who he really was. If his old truths turned out to be false, then all his pride as a warrior was worth nothing. Unable to withstand the pressure, he simply snapped and ran away, leaving his sister and the little one in complete shock. The woman and the child stood frozen in surprise, gazing at the sky. A bright rainbow stretched out right above them. The boy blushed with excitement, urging everyone to look at the wonder. While the woman was worried about Sergio's disappearance, the little one finally understood his anxiety and decided to talk to him properly. Everyone sincerely hoped that this rainbow would become a bridge of reconciliation between the Buryat tribe and the Proudlord family. But suddenly the idyll was interrupted by a strange, alarming rumble. The sound grew closer, resembling a heavy tread. From the saw emerged giant earth dragons, causing the boy to freeze in surprise. The earth trembled. The ground shook under the thundering of a whole horde of earth dragons that emerged from a cloud of dust. The heroes froze before a living wall of scales and spikes, not believing their own eyes. Suddenly, through the roar, a wild realization broke through. A person was riding on one of the monsters. Bartle did not wait and charged into a frontal attack, shouting curses at the rider. His pupils narrowed from rage and adrenaline. The stranger only shouted back angrily, trying to understand who this audacious guy was. Bartle's companion cried out his name in despair, seeing how dangerous this situation was. The clang of steel tore through the air. The blows fell one after another. The girl realized with horror that the Empire had indeed begun its offensive, the sky above the plains suddenly turned blindingly white. A heavy step back under the pressure of the enemy. The gaze froze in extreme tension. Golan pressed harder and harder, forcing Bartle to squeeze out his last strength to avoid breaking. The grip was getting stronger, and the boy had to use his last strength to withstand this insane pressure. The angry foreman grabbed the boy by the neck with an iron grip, sensing that he had gotten into trouble again. A strong push made the young man with the axe freeze in place. He just blinked in confusion, trying to understand why he received such a sudden reprimand. The girl and the little wizard silently watched this tumultuous execution. The old man burst out shouting, calling the boy a fool for trying to attack the savior of their village. The little boy politely stepped forward and introduced himself as Rainford Proudlord, apologizing for his unexpected appearance. The young man was stunned. He could hardly believe that this delicate boy was the same great magician everyone was talking about. He sat down in shame, recalling his father Clayford's command and the strange fog that had just hung in the air. Everyone's attention shifted to the large clay jugs that stood behind. When the peasants saw the fresh water to the brim in them, the boy jumped in surprise, his face elongated from genuine shock. He finally realized that magical mist was actually the rain that filled all the village's supplies. The girl burst out laughing loudly and forcefully shoved his head into the vat, ordering him to stop whining and finally drink. The little magician simply watched calmly the commotion he had caused by his appearance. The giant slurped the treat and burst out an exclamation of delight. It was too delicious. The crowd became noisy. He leaned down to the little one, asking if it was not his magic that helped prepare such a masterpiece. Someone briefly apologized for the recent incident with the water, but immediately got down to business. Sergi stood aside under the gaze of a dozen eyes. The tension in the air vibrated. The man suddenly burst into loud laughter, contemptuously shouting the name Sergio. He loomed over Sergio, throwing in his face that such a loser would never be capable of something like that. The girl couldn't stand the insults and fiercely grabbed the bully by the chest while he continued to humiliate the boy. He only mockingly squinted, saying that he hadn't told a single drop of a lie. She gritted her teeth, gasping from helpless rage. He coldly remarked that if Sergi could do the same as that skinny boy, he wouldn't have had to turn to foreigners for help. A self-satisfied smile never left his face. He continued to revel in his own righteousness. The girl was already beside herself with anger, and her outrage was about to spill over. The girl couldn't hold back and burst into tears, demanding some kind of reaction from her father. The fist involuntarily clenched from the bitter realization of one's own powerlessness. The father coldly remarked that for the Buryat tribe, strength had always been the only measure of worth. He cited Bartle, who leads the Earth Dragon troops and confidently destroys monsters on the plains. She exclaimed indignantly that it was unfair. But the old man was relentless and stated outright that Sergi would never match Bartol in power. While others remained in the shadows, it was Bartle who held back the onslaught of an entire empire with his defensive barriers. Sergi tried to calm his sister, quietly admitting that their father's words were pure truth. The boy looked away, feeling completely helpless and unnecessary. She whispered his name with pain. In his mind, there was only one thought. He had neither Bartle's strength nor Rain's talent for useful magic. The awareness of his own insignificance pressed down on him more and more. Father turned around and dryly ordered to prepare for the evening celebration. He wanted the Buryat tribe to accept them properly. Sergi began with gratitude and apologized to Rain for the fact that the boy had to see him in such a pitiful state. Rain just looked at him in confusion. The man turned around and went to the camp to help with the preparations for the holiday. Horiad Holan did not let go of the girl who demanded freedom, while Ryan tried to understand this confusion. Sergei guessed that the boy was a powerful magician, as such strength was too great to save just one person. One of the warriors merely clicked his tongue in annoyance. Rian silently observed the hustle and bustle around him. Meanwhile, people began to saddle the earth dragons and prepare drinks. The tribe's chief announced that a grand feast would be held in honor of their savior. The red-haired girl smiled sincerely at Ryan, promising him an unforgettable celebration. She apologized again for her brother and what happened earlier. Rian waved his hands, assuring that everything was fine, and thanked her for his own salvation. Both fell silent in awkward silence, not quite understanding each other's words. The girl laughed brightly, explaining that he simply misunderstood her. Golan looked intently into his eyes. eyes, asking if he really did not need her protection during Bartle's attack. She suddenly blushed and waved her hand apologetically. The girl apologized for jumping to conclusions, adding that she had clearly overestimated him. Promising to help with the preparations, she ran away, ignoring his attempts to stop her. He only forced a smile, struck by the fact that she had seen everything, a true warrior from whom nothing can be hidden. Silence. Then, during Bartle's attack, the boy really secretly cast a body-strengthening spell on himself. But something did not give him peace. While he was merely dodging, Golan displayed a completely different level of physical strength. She laughed joyfully, as if not noticing her own strength. Despite her delicate hands, the girl carried huge boxes much more easily than the giant Bartle. He froze in thought. A strange, incomprehensible feeling settled in my chest. The boy was looking at the water, trying to sort out his own thoughts. When a beast emerged from the forest thicket, the boy stepped in front of the younger ones and vowed to protect Golan and Bartle at any cost. His gaze burned with cold determination. A distant memory of the promise to become a leader, much stronger than my father, flashed through my mind. The fists clenched to the crunch. At that time, he sincerely believed that he could protect everyone who lived on the Buryat Plains forever. A quiet curse dissolved in the cold air above the horizon. He was left alone with his pain, hunched over at the edge of the hill. 3 friends hid in the bushes, secretly watching the Earth Dragon and hoping they wouldn't be caught in this prank. In just a moment, they were galloping on the giants, although Goran feared another scolding from the adults until the very end. Stopping by the haystacks far from the village, the girl confessed she had brought them here only because she really wanted to see the dawn together. The dragon confidently walked through the night so that they could reach the place before the first rays of the sun. Years have passed. Now, as a grown woman, she smiled while recalling the times when their trio was inseparable. The celebration was in full swing, although Rain mentally noted that such a warm reception turned out to be a real test. She playfully leaned against the guy, asking if he was even listening to her. Rian simply looked away in confusion. Looking at the joyful crowd, he felt a sincere gratitude that everyone around could finally just enjoy life. Having the mind of an adult in a child's body, he tried his best to suppress the desire to drink alcohol with others. The loud laughter of Bartle and his crew was heard, and his companion warmly noted that despite his fierce appearance, he had a very good heart. She burst into a ringing laugh, while Rain silently observed this happy moment. At least that's how she loved to say it, the companion concluded with a smile. Bartle lost his parents early, so the chief took him in, and the boy vowed to protect Sergei at all costs, the future head of the tribe. But now everything has changed, and there is no trace left of the former devotion. Horan asked if the split really occurred at the moment when Serge discovered his magical abilities. At first, the father was only a little disappointed, hoping for his son's perseverance, while Bartle even supported his friend during those times. The girl again leaned towards the glass, acknowledging her own naivety. Time and circumstances inexorably change people. Unbeknownst to themselves, the once inseparable trio went their separate ways. She bitterly noted that the former world had been destroyed. The main character warned her that she was drinking too much, while a drop slowly fell into the cup, echoing her sad thoughts. The chasm between friends was becoming deeper. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she whispered about the unattainable desire to return to that old closeness. A happy memory flashed before her eyes. Serhi, Bartle, and she, smiling and carefree. Suddenly, the night silence was shattered by a desperate scream about an attack by magical beasts that had invaded the very heart of the village. Horror struck in Horan's eyes. From the darkness emerged huge wolves, howling frantically before the start of the bloody slaughter. The wild wolf lunged at the attack, and the boy barely had time to shout a call to flee. The warriors instantly blocked the path of the beasts, shielding the children with their bodies. The air was cut by a swift, barely noticeable movement. The steel passed through the enemy with a whistle. The boy was stunned, not believing his own eyes. He turned sharply and realized the girl had disappeared from the spot. In the next moment, the predator fell to the ground, cut down in one sweep. The drunken warrior was already calmly standing over the prey. She dealt with the enemy in a fraction of a second. Another deadly strike flashed through the air. While the men were worried about the little ones, a gigantic magical whirlwind spun on the battlefield. A powerful tornado swept away everything in its path, tearing apart the remnants of the wolf pack. The deafening roar signaled the end of the battle. When the dust settled, the children joyfully rushed rush to hug their giant fluffy protector. The last wolves have fled into the forest, and the heroes were finally able to breathe a sigh of relief. Rian dashed away, mentally thanking the gods that the mighty Shiro had stayed to watch over the others. The adult warriors frowned, realizing that they had missed some predators during the last patrol. The commander reassured his comrade if he hadn't interrupted so many beasts earlier, the disaster would have been much larger. The boy just awkwardly smiled, assuring that all the glory belongs to Shiro's magic, not to him. But right behind their backs, the claws on the paw of the slain beast suddenly twitched. While the elder praised Rein for saving the children, a distant scream reached the boy's ears, causing his heart to freeze. It turned out that one wolf had survived and was now slowly driving a lonely child into a trap. The air was pierced by a desperate child's scream. The magical energy around vibrated, preparing for an explosion of power. The little girl, in despair, covered her face with her hands, as there was no chance left to escape from the monster. Rein instantly focused, concentrating all his will in a single glance. He ordered himself to strengthen his legs with magic without an attribute, and prepared for a superhuman leap. Ahead was the wounded Koran, and there were only seconds before the strike, so the boy rushed forward, praying to make it in time. The boy was racing towards the wounded Koran, feverishly wondering if he would make it in time. The huge beast lunged at them, but the boy managed to shield the frightened girl at the last moment. He tightly shut his eyes, awaiting the inevitable deadly blow, but instead of pain, complete misunderstanding came. A powerful shove threw the predator away, raising a cloud of dust. Rian appeared as if out of nowhere, smiled, extended his hand, and asked if they were all right. The boy silently leaned against his savior, unable to utter a word. Images of his father and the warriors who always had the strength to protect others surfaced in his mind. Now Rein stood before him like one who could perform wonders through magic, but he just quietly apologized and refused to accept help, continuing to sit on the ground. He saw fear in the girl's eyes and understood that today he was simply incredibly lucky. The feeling of one's own insignificance struck again, reminding of the true chasm between them. He was disgusted with himself for his weakness and the rage he unleashed on his loved ones out of despair. From time to time, they shoved his complete helplessness in his face. All this shame ultimately turned into fury, which he unleashed on himself and others. He shouted right in his opponent's face, asking if he really craved only pity from those around him. The blonde honestly admitted the life of a mage in the clan of warriors was hard, and he would never fully comprehend that pain. However, he assured that there will definitely be people in the world who can see his true essence. A girl was closely watching the tense conversation from the crowd. Rian stood before the round buildings of the settlement, preparing for a new task. The elder entrusted him to explore the dried-up lake and watch over his son, Sergio. The guys briefly confirmed that they are ready to go out. Rian was already about to leave when his sister called him. She smiled sincerely and promised to make the best dinner if her brother did well. Watching them leave, Rein felt that Sergi had finally shed the heavy burden from his soul. He secretly rejoiced that he didn't get anything for the blown-up cliff in the neighboring village yesterday. It seems that the incident became a real impetus for everyone. Suddenly, a rough voice sounded behind them. Someone was eavesdropping on their conversation. The stranger mentioned Rein's magical training and suddenly grabbed his hand. It was Bartle, and his stern gaze boded nothing good. Relatives could only helplessly clutch their heads as the man once again returned to his old ways. He sneered contemptuously and directly called the boy a weakling who would hardly ever gain strength. Rian did not take his eyes off and silently vowed that he would definitely become a powerful warrior. He excitedly grinned, throwing that he was eagerly waiting for it. A loud, crazy laugh followed behind. Serge called Rein to the road, and the giant wolf simply replied with a brief agreement. The boy glanced back at the girl one last time and finally followed the mentor. Together they climbed to the very top of the rock. The merciless sky froze over the dead landscape. Rein was stunned to see the giant emptiness where a great lake once was. Sergei gloomily added that 2 more bodies of water nearby had evaporated just as quickly. The boy listened in amazement about the mysterious drought. He could not understand at all whether it was possible to dry up such a mass of water without any reason. The climate in this world has never changed so drastically, so the version with the weather was ruled out. Serge admitted that he is not an expert in such complex matters at all. Suddenly, Reina's gaze caught on a strange black pit in the middle of the cracked earth. Sergei explained that the hole leads to a terrifying depth that they have not yet dared to explore. The heroes examined the dry stones, assuming that there had once been a main source here. The man could only sadly state that at this stage, he could not assert anything for sure. The boy glanced at the giant chasm and decided that he could handle such a volume. The satellite was taken aback, not believing his own ears, while the little one explained that the lake would not fill up by itself. He confidently straightened up, and magical spheres began to gather around. If the water does not return on its own, he will have to pour it himself. To do this, one had to hold on to a very specific image in their mind. His old spell for collecting water was too slow. Something truly grand was required here. At that moment, a colossal wall of water crashed down from the sky with a loud shout. Niagara Falls. The raging stream struck the ground with a roar. The boy winked cheerfully, promising to deal with the other two lakes in the same way later. The man was stunned, feverishly thinking whether this could even be called simple magic. Both helplessly fell to the ground before the newly created sea. The little one triumphantly raised his fingers. Operation Niagara ended in complete triumph. Beaming with pride, he solemnly announced that he would name this venture Operation Niagara. While the lake was filling up, the boy pondered how to make good use of this time. He suggested to the mentor to arrange a magical training while the water rises. The man nodded in agreement and decided not to disturb the animals that were sprawled nearby. The little dragon and the fluffy kitten were peacefully sleeping, completely ignoring the conversations. The young man was inspired by the idea and asked to see the entire arsenal of available spells. The sound of water in the background only added to the moment's significance. The mentor took the magical stone and began to invoke the blessings of pure waters. The boy jumped up in anticipation of something grand. He was intently watching every action, not wanting to miss a single detail. The man shouted the name of the technique and released a small water sphere into the air. However, instead of the expected powerful flow, a small portion of water helplessly splashed onto the ground. The student was stunned by what he saw, but quickly commanded to move on to the next spell. The next attempt turned out to be just as modest, only a tiny puddle in the middle of dry land. The mentor only awkwardly blushed, feeling Spanish shame for his might. Sergio blushed deeply and quietly admitted that this spell was the only one he was capable of at all. His companion was left stunned and frozen in place by such an unexpected confession. A long and difficult pause has come. Serge was on the verge of hysteria due to his own worthlessness, so the second one had to almost forcefully calm him down. A sudden flash of awareness made the world around freeze. The hero recalled his own childhood, where magic was as natural a part of life from the very first days as breathing. But the Buryat people lived by completely different, much stricter rules. Serge finally lost hope and fell to his knees, calling himself a completely worthless person. Then the boy decisively asked if there were professional talent assessors in the tribe, as he wanted to figure everything out on his own. He realized that Serge had learned that one magic out of despair for others, and asked how the Buryats generally divide people into classes. The question of how to distinguish between a warrior and a mage made Serge freeze in surprise. It turned out that they had no checks at all. The guy had just accidentally copied text from an old book of his father's, and it miraculously worked. Now the last puzzle in the hero's mind has come together, and he prepared to announce his verdict. Recalling Serge's strength yesterday and Golan's might, he finally understood the main mistake of this tribe. The boy paused for a moment, gathering his thoughts. He directly told the man that he was a wizard, although it sounded like complete nonsense to him. "You are a magician," he repeated once more, cutting off any doubts. The boy added that the blood of an entire generation of wizards flows in his interlocutor's veins. He just blinked in confusion, unable to say a word. In the man's mind, it didn't make sense how this could even be possible. He remembered his ancestors, Lord Basel, Lord Holan, his grandfather and great-grandfather. Could it be that they all hid their true nature? The little one just smiled confidently, as if to say he had warned them. The very magical origin was the key to the incredible power he demonstrated. The man exploded with denials, shouting that the Buryat people are proud warriors, not some kind of sorcerers. Then the guy reminded about the rock from yesterday that he smashed with his fist, explaining that it was just a strengthening of the body with mana. The evidence was undeniable. Who would have thought that with his delicate hands he could easily fend off Bartle's powerful attack? He pointed his finger at Lord Holan, emphasizing that the truth had always been somewhere nearby. Rian explained that the chief's family unconsciously strengthened the body with mana, which is why they were considered just warriors and not mages. The man suggested that his father's legendary endurance was magical, but the boy assured him that those muscles were real. They sat in the middle of the wasteland, and the warrior, although impressed by the praise, still felt awkward. Sweat was dripping down the man's face as he contemplated an important decision. He was frightened by the title of the strongest in history, but Rain quickly brought him back to his senses by reminding him of Bartle's promise to become stronger. The guy suddenly charged with energy and pompously proclaimed the creation of the Alliance for the protection of younger sisters. The warrior merely sighed, acknowledging that he was once again drawn to the old habit of doubting himself. Short pause. Rian slyly winked, asking if he would really give up on the very first day of their alliance. The man seemed to be struck by electricity. He shouted that he would endure any hell during training. He finally understood that the fear of the unknown only hinders his progress. A firm handshake sealed their new agreement. Satisfied with the result, Rain allowed any questions to be asked. He admitted that although he nodded, he still did not understand the main thing, what this mana without attributes actually is. The teacher and the student stood facing each other, clasping hands to begin an important training session. A command was issued to start training from the very basics. Relatives froze on the threshold, unable to finish the greeting phrase out of surprise. The little one, with a joyful shout, rushed into his brother's arms, who had finally returned home. But the hero's strength instantly left him. He simply collapsed to the ground, gasping that he couldn't even move from exhaustion. While he lay unconscious, the girl anxiously checked to see if he was all right. She just gently smiled through her tears, listening to how that fool began to mumble something amusing in his sleep. Only the ravaged land, cut by deep cracks, was left behind. Calm reigned over the remnants of the battlefield, and the ravaged land was slowly covered by the calm surface of the newly formed lake. The sky was covered with thick clouds. The boy stood frozen at the edge of the slope, looking down in surprise. He was sure that just yesterday he had filled this lake himself. Together with his companion, he gazed into the void, not believing his own eyes. The water level has indeed become noticeably lower. They assumed that the dried soil had simply absorbed all the moisture like a sponge. However, a mysterious black hole gaping in the cracked earth would not let Sergio rest. Ultimately, he decided that it was just his imagination playing tricks, and he agreed to postpone the investigation for later. The boy got to his feet. Straighten your back. It was time to move on to special training, as only Sergio's water magic could save the settlement from thirst. He just nodded briefly in response. They decided to start the lesson by reviewing yesterday's lessons right there on the rock. The air around vibrated as the boy began to concentrate, trying to feel the flows of mana. He closed his eyes and completely cleared his mind of unnecessary thoughts. Rian ordered Sergio to activate the non-tributary magic without any spells, focusing on physical enhancement. The dim light began to pulse in the darkness. The streams of mana swirled around the warrior's legs. The essence was simple. No words, only pure will. Sergi was in shock watching his own aura, while a pleased Rain rejoiced at his student's first success. The warrior instantly realized that before him stood not just a child, but a true genius with incredible potential. Everything went perfectly, and the man felt such ease in controlling his own strength for the first time. Locals believed that without singing, the magic of spells was impossible, and even Reina's mother could not break this rule. But the guy simply didn't know about these limitations, so the absence of common sense became his main advantage. While Sergio was trying to recover, Rain calmly stated that only constant practice solves everything. He explained, magic requires only one thing, the creation of the clearest image in the mind. It is necessary to repeat this until the launch becomes instantaneous, like a reflex during a regular strike. Rian noticed that Serge's image had become crystal clear, but he was already sweating from the tension and begging for a break. "Stop! Stop immediately!" the boy exclaimed in fear, seeing that the warrior was about to explode from the overload. Sergi admitted that his magic was purely self-taught experience, but it was precisely this that allowed him to master the non-elemental spells. While they were resting, it became clear that the boy's diligence had finally paid off, especially in terms of the volume of mana. Even before the arrival of the teacher, Sergio was fully engaged, using his powers to help the villagers. He gave his all without reserve. Now, they both sat in the middle of the wasteland, wasteland, completely exhausted after the training. And so it went on for whole days. The constant work for the peasants ultimately benefited Sergio himself. The boy did it unconsciously for a long time, simply following the call of his heart. Each time magic was used at the limit, his maximum mana reserve increased, and now it significantly exceeded previous levels. Sergi decisively clapped his hands, although he once only lamented his own helplessness. He struggled to get up, muttering that he had indeed become too relaxed. The break time is over, so it's time to try to create a water balloon. They stood facing each other, ready for a new stage. The boy extended his hands forward, concentrating all his will on the task. Sergi squinted, trying to squeeze out the remnants of concentration. In his mind, the smile of rain flickered, while sweat treacherously flooded his eyes. He extended his hands forward, and a dense sphere of magic flared up between his palms. Little Al held his breath, afraid to miss even a moment. With a jerk, Sergi let out a wild scream and pushed all the accumulated strength into the sky. His face had paled from exhaustion, and the little one next to him trembled. He literally squeezed into the rock, feeling an incredible pressure of energy. The boy joyfully exclaimed that today the water had risen significantly more than yesterday. He enthusiastically supported his friend, not noticing how he suddenly gave up. Sergio's hand fell helplessly. Looking at the turbulent water, he realized that this was the ceiling of his current magical powers. The tired gaze was fixed on the lake as the image of how the rain poured in surfaced in memory. With a dull sound, the guy thudded onto the rock, rasping an apology for the empty reservoir. The friend barely managed to catch the exhausted Sergi, who had completely depleted his mana. Rian exclaimed in amazement, noticing that the water level in the lake had risen incredibly quickly since yesterday. He was generous with his praise for Sergio. Suddenly, Serhi collapsed and fell to the ground. The mana ran out instantly, and he barely squeezed out the words about the limit he had reached. The boy stated that with his current reserve, this was the maximum. He recalled how the rain filled the lake yesterday and tried to match that result. Falling onto the stones, Sergi hoarsely mumbled an apology for his weakness. However, Ryan cheerfully suggested trying once more. He insisted on continuing the training. Despite the student's exhaustion, Rain was genuinely happy with such rapid progress in just one day. The teacher's excitement completely consumed him, and he was already dreaming of squeezing even more out of Sergio. Lying helplessly, Serhi pleaded for a break, as he was completely drained. Rian just smiled gently and asked what it was all about. He clenched his fist resolutely, leaning over the exhausted comrade. Rain coldly stated that they had just been resting. Rian took up the task again, breathing heavily from the tension. He leaned over the exhausted Sergi, deciding to use a special method he had observed in the elf village. The boy remembered this technique yesterday when he saw how quickly his partner exhausted all of his magical energy. A memory surfaced before his eyes of how the elves collectively passed their mana to him. Thus, for Serhi, an endless cycle of training, complete exhaustion, and painful forced recovery began. Although the magic was returning, the body could not keep up with the pace, and the boy collapsed on the way home. Rain slyly winked and asked if this was really the limit of his strength. He reminded him of their alliance for the protection of younger sisters and challenged his friend, recalling his promise to the teacher to become invincible. Sergi listened silently, lying on the hot ground. Overcoming fatigue, he began to rise and admitted that he had once again allowed himself to be weak-willed. The boys tightly clasped their hands, and Sergi himself demanded to make their training even stricter. Rain broke into a wide smile, promising a second immediate and complete injection of mana. Sergi waved his hands in panic, trying to beg for at least a minute of peace. But Rain only loudly encouraged him at the top of his lungs, urging him to continue the fight among the mountain ridges. Sergi's training weeks passed in constant motion, from exhausting fencing to endless piles of papers. The day has come when the teacher finally acknowledged that he had passed on everything he knew to the boys. His young partner only confirmed that Sergi was also giving his all. Basil sincerely thanked the student for their patience during this long and difficult preparation. Although the giant was surprised in his thoughts, the boy had not developed a mountain of muscles as he had imagined. He scrutinized the eyes of the pupil. Sergi met this gaze with a barely noticeable, confident smile. Then Basil realized the boy had changed not externally, but deeply inside, becoming almost unrecognizable. unrecognizable. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the scream of Horan, who flew into the hall, calling for her father and brother. Sergi briefly responded to the call. The boy next to him just nodded contentedly, supporting the elevated mood. Everyone turned around in surprise at the noise. The master tried to calm the girl by reminding her that they had not yet finished their conversation. But looking at the student one last time, he finally acknowledged Serhi had become much stronger. The girl froze in place, feeling her heart skip a beat from a bad premonition. Suddenly, Sergi appeared. He smirked slyly and declared that it was time to fulfill an old promise. The guest boldly scheduled a meeting in the central square, to which he received a brief and confident yes. Oppressive silence fell. Bartle looked away, as if he had known about this visit for a long time. The boy noticed with surprise that today the teacher looked completely different than usual. Bartle only confirmed that he was waiting for the opponent's arrival at that very time. He wore the formal attire of a warrior from the Buryat tribe, which was only worn for duels. This indicated an intention to fight to the end, putting everything he had at stake. Bartle gently stroked his sister's head, making her blush with embarrassment. His large palm froze for a moment, calming the girl. She merely whispered "brother" in confusion as he stood next to her. In her eyes, a silent anxiety froze halfway with hope. The man's gaze became steely. He was determined to finally put an end to this matter. The sky trembled from the loud cry of ascension. In the middle of the trampled field, a rider on his lizard stood still, surrounded by hundreds of curious eyes. The crowd instantly erupted in whispers. Could it be that Bartle really dared to take on such a dangerous duel? One of the participants just smiled predatorily, anticipating the imminent clash. Bartle calmly waited, firmly holding the reins of his scaled beast. Finally, Sergi arrived, and Bartle greeted his opponent with a brief remark. Sergi apologized for the delay, while their dragons cracked their necks ominously before the fight. The elder reminded that both warriors are dressed in traditional costumes of the Buryat tribe, as required by ancient custom. He officially began the ritual of the tribal duel and asked one last time if anyone among them intended to retreat. The man fell silent, intently watching the fighters. Both warriors shouted their agreement in unison, ready to fight to the end. In the midst of the emptiness, the beginning of the duel was announced under the strict laws of the Buryats, where only weapons were prohibited. The opponents stood frozen opposite each other, having received the order to fight at the limits of their abilities. The boy nervously counted the allowed methods, from eye gouging to deadly strangulations. He was shocked that in this circle, everything that is usually considered a foul play is legal. The tension skyrocketed. Under such conditions, the duel could easily have ended in the death of one of them. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a cry about a single desire. The elder commanded Bartle to voice his will, which he would receive in case of triumph. A predatory smile flashed across the fighter's face. His gaze radiated wild confidence. Bartle pointed his finger at the enemy and declared he will drive him away and lead the clan himself. Bystanders around were left gaping in shock at such audacity. He added that in case of defeat, he would go into exile and forever forget the name of his lineage. Bartle assumed a fighting stance, stating that the rules are now as simple as possible to understand. The leader took these conditions hard, although they tried to prevent him from making a reckless move. Sergio abruptly interrupted the leader, briefly stating that there had been enough talk. Bartle was stunned as the enemy, with a sinister smile, asked for his consent. The boy rushed forward, ignoring the desperate scream behind him. He just clenched his teeth fiercely. A powerful surge raised a cloud of dust into the air. The gaze became sharp and fully focused on the target. Every muscle was tensed to the limit. A terrible explosion shattered the air, scattering the wall into pieces. A huge hole gaped in the stone, from which thick smoke was pouring out. A terrible thought pierced his consciousness. Sergi had not managed to activate the body enhancement magic. A desperate gasp cut through the silence. The magic failed at the most critical moment. Everyone froze, expecting the worst. The boy, in horror, covered his mouth with his hands, not believing his own eyes. The girl desperately screamed, calling for her older brother. He boldly challenged his opponent to a fight, sensing that he had become much stronger. The boy calmly wiped his hand, focusing on the enemy. A man and a girl were frozen in anxious anticipation. The stones fell from the edge of the cliff due to the tension. The aggressor lunged forward with a shout, asking if this was an attempt to apologize for his former cowardice. He snarled fiercely, quietly, not receiving any emotion in response from the hero. The attacker continued to mock, believing that he was simply afraid to take the fight seriously. A barrage of blows rained down on the boy, raising clouds of dust. Relatives were frozen in fear, watching this execution. The man had already begun to mock the lack of resistance, but suddenly his confidence changed to wild fear. The saw settled, and before him stood an absolutely whole and unscathed hero. The boy smiled contentedly upon seeing the real fruits of his exhausting training. He proudly attributed his unscathed condition to the fruits of exhausting training. Bartle was stunned, not understanding how, after his devastating attack on the enemy, there was not a single scratch left. He looked at his hands in confusion, unable to believe in the powerlessness of his own weapon. His massive axe simply plunged into the ground, becoming a useless piece of iron. While Bartle was coming to his senses, Sergei calmly walked past him through the gap in the wall. The boy stopped, and his gaze became sharp as a blade. He began to speak, and there was not a trace of doubt in his voice. Sergei stated outright that Bartle would not rest until they faced each other in a true, deadly battle. "Then hold on, Sergei!" roared the opponent, and gripped the handle with a dead grip. Bartle raised his weapon, openly declaring that he would now fight with the sole intention of killing. Seeing this, the girl rushed to the leader in horror, begging to stop the violation of the rules. She was stunned by the answer. If both fighters agree, the law becomes just a formality. The father coldly added that the ban was only a principle that had now ceased to be in effect. With a wild scream, Bartle soared into the air, unleashing all his fury on the unflinching Sergio. With one swift motion, he closed the distance, lunging straight at the unyielding opponent. His face was twisted into a predatory grin in anticipation of the finale. A huge blade descended with a roar, but the boy stopped the blow with his bare hands. While the stunned Bartle tried to comprehend what he had seen, the hero calmly announced his move. He focused, preparing to show the true result of his painful training. With a powerful strike, Niagara Alloy unleashed a torrent of devastating force upon the enemy. In his memory, the day emerged when he desperately asked not to be comforted with empty hopes. At that time, he did not believe in any advice. The bitterness of lacking talent seemed unbearable to him. Now Bartle was lifted into the air by the force of his explosive move. The sun was setting beyond the horizon, and in the silence, a question echoed, "Is it not too painful to fight like this?" The girl only scolded Bartle irritably for his foolishness. The Trinity stood still on the rock, silently watching the sunset. He turned around and walked away, finally free of all the regrets of the past. As a farewell, it was said that now, without any regret, he could move on. Bartle flew down, stunned by the power of his opponent, which seemed to him like real cheating. He lay helplessly on the ground after the crushing defeat. The fragments of the weapon scattered in all directions. The blow was final. The judge immediately stopped the match, announcing the final. Sergei became the winner, and the crowd erupted with incredible excitement. People could not believe their eyes. He knocked out the fearsome Bartle with a single blow. Sergei slowly approached his fallen opponent. He stopped nearby, silently looking into the eyes of the defeated. Bartle felt a strange relief upon realizing that their people were now completely safe. He grunted, asking if Sergei had come just to mock the loser. The boy simply called him by name softly, and Bartle replied that he had always believed in him. The man shuddered upon seeing tears welling up on Sergio's face. The memory of a childhood promise pierced his heart. Sergio regretted that because of his past weakness, Bartle had to endure so much. Bartle tried to joke about the eternal crybaby while his sister, in tears, pressed against him on the cold ground. Goran attacked Bartle with accusations, stating that the whole village had seen his clumsy attempts to restore his brother's confidence. Bartle just waved it off indifferently while lying on the ground and muttered that he was just doing what he wanted. At that moment, an elder approached them. Bartle closed his eyes and calmly acknowledged his defeat, promising to leave immediately. The chief was beginning to agree, but someone's desperate scream made everyone flinch. It was Sergei. He stepped forward and firmly stated that he had not yet named his award for victory. The boy remembered everyone, his mentor Ryan, his brother who had always been his goal, and the caring Goran. The elder nodded, allowing the young man to express his desire. Sergei clenched the fabric of his clothing tightly in his fist. He looked at Bartle, who had never abandoned him, and continued to support him even in the toughest times. Sergei declared that from now on, he wants to live on these lands together with them. them, helping each other. A short pause has come. Bartle listened to these words and understood. He had become strong only because of those who were by his side. Serge made the final step and finally uttered what he desired above all else. He just exhaled briefly, finally understanding everything. A friend muttered through his teeth that these words came too late. He could no longer bear the pain. He broke down in tears, calling his friend a cursed fool. The three of them embraced tightly, crying out everything that had accumulated over the long years. The girl pretended to be angry at these unbearable crybabies, although she herself was barely holding it together. Sergi watched them from afar, crying with genuine happiness for his friends. She tightly clutched their clothes, feeling how unreliable they were without her supervision. The rainbow cut through the sky, stitching together their childhood and this long-awaited moment of reconciliation.